History remembers its victories, but it whispers about its shadows. Across ruined cities, sealed archives, and oceans that keep their dead, questions linger without answers. A vanished expedition whose final message stopped mid-sentence, a signal recorded once and never again. Footprints where no traveler should have stood. Centuries pass, yet the silence only grows heavier. Tonight, we step into 3 hours of secrets that refuse burial, stories documented, debated, and still unresolved. Not legend, not myth, but mysteries that continue to disturb the present. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's descend slowly into the unknown. In the early hours before dawn, the sky above the Mediterranean should have carried a faint silver glow, the quiet promise of sunrise spreading over stone streets and sleeping harbors. Instead, in the year 536, the light arrived dim and uncertain, more like a fading twilight than the beginning of a day. Across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, observers would later describe a sun that shone without warmth, as though veiled behind a thin but stubborn curtain. The seasons themselves seemed to hesitate. Contemporary writers struggled to explain what they were seeing. The Byzantine historian Procopius recorded that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during an eclipse, and that this strange dimness persisted for many months. In Ireland, monastic chronicles noted a failure of bread. In China, reports spoke of summer snow and widespread famine. These accounts emerged independently, separated by thousands of miles, yet they described a world that felt suddenly subdued, cooler, darker, and uncertain. Modern science offers possibilities. Ice core samples taken from Greenland and Antarctica contain layers of sulfate deposits dating precisely to the mid-6th century. Such chemical traces often point to massive volcanic eruptions, events powerful enough to hurl ash and gas high into the atmosphere, where they can reflect sunlight and lower global temperatures. Some researchers suggest a single colossal eruption, perhaps in Iceland or North America. Others propose a sequence of eruptions, each compounding the last, extending the darkness for years rather than months. Tree rings provide another quiet testimony. Across regions of the Northern Hemisphere, growth patterns from 536 onward become unusually thin, signaling cold and environmental stress. In some reconstructions, the decade that followed ranks among the coldest in the last 2,000 years. Harvests would have failed not once, but repeatedly. Hunger, displacement, and disease often follow such disruptions, and indeed, only a few years later, the first wave of what became known as the Justinianic Plague began to spread through Mediterranean ports and inland cities. Yet even with geological evidence and climate models, uncertainty remains. If a volcano was responsible, why do written descriptions emphasize darkness more than dramatic skies or falling ash? Why do some regions report effects sooner than others? And why did the dimness seem to linger beyond what a single eruption might cause? Alternative ideas have surfaced over time, some grounded in astronomy, others drifting toward speculation. A cometary impact or near pass has been proposed, dust from a fragmented celestial body spreading through the upper atmosphere. There are also hypotheses involving atmospheric dust from distant deserts or even changes in solar activity. None have fully satisfied the evidence, but each attempts to answer the same persistent question. What could dim the entire world so suddenly? Cultural memory adds another layer. In various traditions, the mid-6th century becomes associated with omens, divine warning, or the turning of an age. When environments shift without explanation, meaning often fills the silence. People look upward and search for intention in the sky's refusal to brighten. Were these simply metaphors shaped by hardship, or echoes of an event so unusual that ordinary language failed to contain it? What is most striking is how fragile normality appears in these records. A slight change in sunlight, A few degrees of cooling, and entire systems, agriculture, trade, health, begin to strain. The year of endless night was not marked by a single catastrophic moment, but by a slow, persistent dimming. A world that should have felt familiar instead felt altered, as though history itself had taken a quieter, colder breath. Today, satellite measurements and climate science allow us to trace patterns invisible to ancient observers. We can model volcanic plumes, analyze microscopic particles in ice, and compare tree growth across continents. And yet, despite all this precision, the experience of 536 still resists complete clarity. Data outlines the event but does not fully capture its cause or its human meaning. Somewhere between the chemical record in polar ice and the fearful lines in forgotten chronicles lies the full story of that darkened sky. Perhaps it was a chain of natural disasters, rare but not impossible. Perhaps something less understood briefly altered the balance between Earth and Sun. Or perhaps the mystery persists because the past does not always leave answers in forms we recognize. The sun eventually brightened again. Crops returned. Empires continued their slow transformations. But for a time, the world lived beneath a dimmed horizon, uncertain whether the light would fully return. And if such a shadow once fell across the entire planet, quietly, without warning, what might that suggest about how much of our history still waits in darkness, just beyond the reach of explanation? And as the dim skies of 536 slowly lifted, history did what it often does. It continued forward, carrying with it memories that blurred into legend and questions that settled quietly into the margins of record. Centuries passed. Empires rose and receded. Yet across medieval Europe, another story would emerge, smaller in scale but no less unsettling, centered not on the sky above, but on the silence left behind when children vanished. In the city of Basel, where the Rhine bends gently between stone embankments and narrow streets, the past still lingers in textures rather than words. Church towers cast long afternoon shadows over squares that have gathered footsteps for hundreds of years. Markets once filled the air with voices, trade, and the ordinary rhythms of medieval life. It is within this familiar setting that an unfamiliar absence was first remembered, an event preserved in fragments, retellings, and uneasy speculation. The disappearance of a group of children. Accounts vary in detail, as medieval sources often do. Some chronicles suggest the event occurred in the late 13th century, others place it slightly earlier or later. The number of children shifts depending on the telling, sometimes dozens, sometimes more. What remains consistent is the central image. Young people leaving the city together, drawn by a purpose not fully explained, and never returning in any confirmed way. To modern readers, the story echoes the broader tradition of the Children's Crusade, a loosely documented movement in which groups of European youths reportedly set out toward the eastern Mediterranean, believing faith alone would open the sea before them. Whether such journeys occurred exactly as described remains debated among historians. Some argue the narratives were later moral tales shaped by religious imagination. Others believe smaller, more fragmented migrations may have taken place, later woven into a single legend. Basel's version feels quieter, more localized, less a grand march across continents and more a gradual slipping away. There are suggestions of economic hardship during the period, of famine cycles and social strain that could have pushed families toward desperate decisions. In such conditions, children might have been sent away in search of work, apprenticeships, or safety. Over time, absence can transform into mystery, especially when records are sparse and grief has no clear ending. Yet certain details resist easy explanation. Some retellings describe music, an unseen piper or guiding sound leading the children outward. Others speak of a sudden departure, coordinated yet undocumented, as though the group moved between one moment and the next without leaving a clear trace. These motifs appear in other European legends, most famously in the story of Hamelin. Folklore scholars often interpret such elements symbolically, representing disease, migration, or collective trauma translated into narrative form. Still, symbols usually grow from something real. A disappearance large enough to be remembered suggests an event that unsettled the community. Parish records from the medieval period are incomplete, and civic documentation was not designed to preserve every personal loss. If dozens of children truly vanished, through travel, illness, trafficking, or disaster, the historical silence that followed might not be evidence against the event, but part of its explanation. Environmental factors have also been considered. The Rhine, while beautiful, has long been unpredictable. Floods could arrive with little warning, reshaping banks and sweeping away anything in their path. Could a journey along the river have ended in catastrophe, remembered only through rumor? Or did groups of migrants simply disperse into distant regions, their identities absorbed into new towns where origin no longer mattered? More speculative interpretations move beyond social history into the psychology of memory. Medieval communities often processed tragedy collectively, embedding painful realities inside stories that softened or redirected blame. A tale of enchanted music or divine calling might conceal harsher truths, poverty, exploitation, or abandonment, transformed over generations into something both safer and stranger. And then there is the possibility, difficult to measure but persistent in human storytelling, that not every remembered event fits comfortably within modern categories. Throughout history, communities have described moments when ordinary patterns seemed briefly suspended, when people followed impulses they could not later explain, or when groups moved with a shared certainty that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Whether understood as spiritual fervor, social contagion, or something unnamed, such experiences blur the boundary between history and mystery. Walking through Basel today, nothing outwardly signals that children once disappeared from its streets. Trams pass where carts once rolled. Windows glow with evening light. The river continues its steady course toward the sea. Cities are skilled at absorbing their past, layering centuries until only careful listening reveals what lies beneath. Yet the endurance of the story suggests that something, loss, migration, tragedy, or transformation, left a mark strong enough to survive without clear documentation. Memory persisted even when evidence faded, and sometimes what endures in silence tells us as much as what survives in ink. If a group of children truly walked away from Basel, where did their path lead? Into distant towns where new names replaced old ones? Into disaster unrecorded by history's fragile pages? Or into a space between fact and legend where unanswered questions continue to echo? The streets remain, the river flows, and the records stay incomplete. Somewhere in that quiet intersection between history and memory, the disappearance waits, unconfirmed, unexplained, and still gently asking to be understood. And as the unanswered footsteps of Basel fade into the quiet corridors of memory, the journey through history's darker uncertainties continues, moving not west across medieval Europe, but southeast toward the dry plains of Mesopotamia, where grief, devotion, and atmosphere itself seem to merge into something harder to explain. Karbala rises from the desert in tones of dust, gold, and muted blue. Domes catch the sun during the day, while at night the horizon stretches wide and unbroken, a sky so vast it feels almost physical. Pilgrims have crossed these lands for centuries, drawn by remembrance. The air carries prayer, mourning, and the slow passage of time layered upon a single place. Yet among the many traditions tied to Karbala, there are occasional references to days when the sky itself seemed to darken. periods remembered not only for sorrow, but for an unusual dimness that lingered overhead. These accounts are difficult to trace with precision. Some appear in later devotional writings, others in regional oral histories passed quietly between generations. Descriptions vary: a sun veiled behind unnatural haze, daylight fading into a reddish or ashen gloom, shadows stretching longer than they should. In certain tellings, the darkness coincides with moments of collective mourning connected to the tragedy of 680 AD, when the Battle of Karbala transformed the site into one of the most sacred landscapes in Islamic memory. Historians approach such descriptions carefully. Religious literature often uses cosmic imagery to express spiritual magnitude: skies darkening, earth trembling, stars withdrawing their light. These motifs appear across cultures and centuries, shaping emotional truth rather than meteorological record. From this perspective, the Black Sky Days may reflect the depth of communal grief, a poetic language powerful enough to survive long after precise weather conditions were forgotten. Yet, the natural world offers its own possibilities. Southern Iraq lies within reach of intense dust storms capable of turning midday into twilight. Fine particles lifted high into the atmosphere can mute sunlight, tint the sky copper or gray, and settle slowly over cities and shrines. Volcanic eruptions far beyond the region, sometimes thousands of miles away, have also been known to dim skies across continents. Historical climate disruptions, like those seen in the 6th century, remind us how interconnected atmosphere and memory can become. Could unusual environmental events have coincided with periods of mourning in Karbala, later woven together into a single narrative? It would not be the first time human experience fused sky and sorrow into one enduring image. When communities endure trauma, the environment around them often becomes part of the story, as though nature itself paused in recognition. Still, certain elements remain harder to categorize. Some oral traditions speak not just of dimness, but of a stillness in the air. Birds quiet, winds subdued, sound carrying differently across the plain. Others mention a darkness that felt localized, centered near the sacred precinct rather than spread across the wider region. Such details are nearly impossible to verify, yet they persist in retellings, suggesting that witnesses experienced something they struggled to describe in ordinary terms. Psychology offers another lens. Collective mourning, especially when ritualized over generations, can shape perception in subtle ways. During intense emotional gatherings, attention narrows, senses heighten, and ordinary changes in light or weather may feel charged with deeper meaning. The boundary between external event and internal experience becomes difficult to separate. What one generation interprets spiritually, another may later search for in climate data or atmospheric science. There is also the question of transmission. Stories repeated across centuries rarely remain unchanged. Each retelling selects certain details, softens others, and adapts to the needs of the present. Darkness in the sky may once have been a brief storm, later remembered as a sign. Or perhaps something genuinely unusual occurred, rare enough to resist simple explanation, yet subtle enough to leave only scattered traces in written history. Modern observation brings clarity to many ancient mysteries, but not all. Satellite imagery can track dust plumes, and climate records can reconstruct volcanic winters. Yet such tools cannot easily reach into the emotional landscape of the past, where meaning and memory intertwine. Even if a precise atmospheric cause were identified, would it fully explain why the event endured in spiritual memory rather than scientific record? Walking through Karbala today, the sky appears ordinary, bright in the heat of afternoon, luminous with stars after sunset. Pilgrims continue to arrive, carrying personal griefs that merge with historical remembrance. Nothing visible suggests that daylight once faltered here in any unusual way. And yet the persistence of the story invites quiet attention. Perhaps the black sky days were metaphors shaped by devotion. Perhaps they were dust, distant eruption, or rare convergence of natural events. Or perhaps they belonged to that narrow space where history records the outline of something felt more deeply than it was measured. If the sky over Karbala truly darkened beyond the ordinary, even briefly, what did those who stood beneath it believe they were witnessing? And how many moments in history, unwritten, half-remembered, or transformed by faith, still wait above us, hidden in plain sight, until someone thinks to look up and ask why the light once changed at all? And as the sky above Karbala returns to its familiar brightness, history shifts once more, away from open desert and sacred memory, toward the enclosed shadows of medieval Rome, where mystery would take a form far more tangible. Here, the unanswered question was not written in clouds or carried by wind, but seated silently upon a throne. The Latrine Palace in the late 9th century stood as both sanctuary and fortress, its halls echoing with prayer, intrigue, and the fragile balance of power that defined the medieval papacy. Candlelight flickered against stone walls darkened by smoke and time. Beyond the doors, Rome itself was restless, caught between rival factions, shifting loyalties, and the constant pressure of political survival. It was within this tense atmosphere, in the year 897 AD, that one of history's most unsettling trials would unfold. The event would later be called the Cadaver Synod. According to surviving accounts, the body of Pope Formosus, dead for several months, was exhumed from its tomb, dressed again in papal vestments, and placed upon a throne inside a church to stand trial. Clergy gathered, accusations were read aloud, a deacon was appointed to answer on behalf of the silent corpse. The charges concerned violations of canon law and the turbulent politics of Formosus's reign, particularly his shifting alliances among competing imperial claimants. Even by the standards of medieval power struggles, the scene is difficult to comprehend. A courtroom in which one participant could neither speak nor move. Ritual language directed toward someone beyond earthly judgment. The boundary between justice, theater, and vengeance blurred almost completely. Most historians interpret the synod through the lens of political conflict. The late 9th century was a period of instability for the papacy, with rapid successions of popes and strong influence from Roman noble families. Formosus had supported one imperial faction. His successor, Pope Stephen VI, aligned with another. Condemning the dead predecessor may have been less about theology and more about rewriting legitimacy, erasing decisions that threatened current power. From this perspective, the macabre trial becomes grimly rational. Medieval societies often treated the body as legally and spiritually significant even after death. Posthumous punishments were not unheard of. Declaring Formosus invalid could nullify his ordinations and political acts, reshaping authority in the present. Yet explanation does not dissolve unease. Chroniclers describe the corpse swaying as accusations were shouted, the courtroom charged with tension that bordered on hysteria. After condemnation, the vestments were stripped away, 3 fingers used for blessing were cut off, and the body was eventually cast into the Tiber River. Later reports claim the corpse was recovered downstream and began to attract stories of miracles, whispers that the disgraced pope possessed unexpected sanctity. Here, history becomes harder to separate from rumor. Medieval writers often blended observation with moral interpretation, shaping narratives that warned, justified, or inspired. Were miracle stories expressions of popular resistance against political cruelty, attempts to restore dignity to the dishonored dead, or simply the natural growth of legend around an event already strange enough to invite myth? Psychology offers another dimension. Public rituals involving death can both reinforce authority and reveal insecurity. By staging such an extreme spectacle, Stephen VI may have sought absolute control over memory itself. proving that even the past could be judged and overturned. But the intensity of the act suggests something less stable beneath the surface. Displays meant to secure power sometimes expose fear instead. Indeed, the aftermath was swift and violent. Public outrage reportedly grew. Stephen VI was deposed, imprisoned, and later died under unclear circumstances. Subsequent popes reversed the synod's decisions, then reversed the reversals, as though Rome itself could not decide what the event should mean. The historical record becomes a pattern of erasure and restoration, memory condemned and rehabilitated in cycles. And still, questions linger beyond politics. What atmosphere inside that chamber allowed educated clergy to proceed with such a trial? Did participants feel certainty, dread, or disbelief? How did ordinary Romans interpret the sight of a dead pope judged by the living? Some historians suggest the period's apocalyptic expectations, fears about the approaching millennium, may have intensified symbolic actions. Others see only the raw mechanics of factional struggle, stripped of later romanticism. There is also the quieter mystery of perception. Across centuries, the Cadaver Synod feels almost unreal, as though it belongs more to allegory than to documented history. Yet the sources, though imperfect, consistently affirm that something very much like this occurred. The past occasionally produces moments so extreme that later generations struggle to fit them into familiar categories of behavior. Today, the Latrine complex stands renewed, its surfaces restored, its corridors open to pilgrims and visitors who move through sunlight rather than torchlight. Nothing visible suggests that a corpse once occupied a throne here, accused by the living in a ritual both legal and theatrical. Stone remembers differently than text. It keeps silence where chronicles keep detail. And perhaps that silence is part of the mystery. Because the Cadaver Synod is not only a story about one pope or one political conflict, it is a glimpse into how power confronts death, how institutions attempt to control legacy, and how memory resists even the most dramatic efforts at erasure. The event survives precisely because it feels impossible, yet history insists it happened. If a society can place the dead on trial to reshape the living present, what does that reveal about the boundaries between justice, belief, and fear? And how many other moments, equally unsettling, less carefully recorded, have vanished into the spaces where history grows quiet, leaving only questions seated where certainty once stood? And as the echoes of Rome's most macabre trials fade into memory, the journey of history's darker mysteries carries us far from stone corridors and candlelit chambers. We move now to the equatorial plains of East Africa, where the calm of everyday village life would be shattered by a phenomenon that defied explanation, leaving scholars, anthropologists, and psychologists alike struggling to understand what had occurred. In 1962, a small village called Kashasha, nestled on the western shores of Lake Victoria in what was then Tanganyika, seemed at first like any other. Narrow paths wound between simple homes, the air carried the scent of the lake, and children played beneath the shade of acacia trees. The sun rose and fell with the familiar rhythms of daily life, until a ripple of laughter began that would not stop. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. A young girl, a school pupil, began laughing uncontrollably during class. Her laughter seemed to surge without cause, erupting in waves that left her breathless. Teachers tried to soothe her, but the sounds persisted. Within days, the laughter spread to classmates, neighbors, and eventually to entire villages. People of all ages were caught in episodes of mirth that could last hours, sometimes days, often leaving them unable to work, eat, or sleep properly. Anthropologists and medical teams later documented the outbreak with meticulous care. Over the course of weeks, what began as a single student's laughter escalated into a phenomenon affecting hundreds of people. Schools closed, businesses shuttered, and communities became isolated. In some cases, those affected were taken to hospitals for observation only to experience the same bouts there. The laughter seemed contagious, yet not in any conventional sense of disease. There was no fever, no infection, and no identifiable pathogen. Mainstream explanations have focused on psychological and sociological factors. Stress, social tension, and communal anxiety, compounded by the pressures of a recently independent nation, may have created conditions for what psychologists call mass psychogenic illness. In this framework, laughter becomes a physical manifestation of stress released collectively, a shared coping mechanism against the uncertainty and social change surrounding everyday life. Yet these explanations, while rational, do not capture the strangeness of the event. The laughter was reported with such intensity, duration, and geographical spread that it feels almost impossible to reduce it entirely to social stress. Villages separated by miles were affected sequentially, with symptoms appearing and receding in patterns that challenge straightforward modeling. Why did some communities never experience the outbreak at all, while others were engulfed for months? Why did it begin in one small school and radiate outward with such precision? Other observers have speculated about environmental or neurological triggers. Could a toxin, a contaminant in local food or water, have played a role? Some early studies explored this possibility, though no consistent evidence was found. Could mass suggestion amplify subtle physiological effects into a collective phenomenon, transforming ordinary laughter into an epidemic capable of shutting down entire villages? Even today, the full mechanism remains a subject of debate. Beyond the science, there is the human experience. Contemporary accounts describe laughter that alternated with tears, episodes of exhaustion, and periods of despair. Entire classrooms would dissolve into uncontrollable fits. Families were displaced temporarily, livelihoods interrupted, and the usual boundaries of social order disrupted. For those who lived through it, the laughter was both a source of bewilderment and genuine fear, a reminder that even something as seemingly innocent as mirth could become unsettling when stripped from context. Cultural factors may have intensified the phenomenon. In communities where oral tradition and social cohesion are strong, collective behaviors can be magnified. Stories and legends passed through families may have lent structure to the otherwise chaotic experience, amplifying the contagiousness of the laughter in ways that cannot be measured in scientific terms alone. The interplay between social expectation, human psychology, and environmental circumstances remains a fertile ground for speculation. Even decades later, the Tanganyika laughter epidemic continues to fascinate researchers. Scholars who have returned to the region attempt to reconstruct the timeline, interview witnesses, and examine the social conditions of the early 1960s. Yet despite these efforts, no definitive cause emerges. No single explanation reconciles the intensity, duration, and distribution of the outbreak. The event sits uneasily at the intersection of epidemiology, psychology, and folklore, a reminder that not every historical anomaly can be neatly classified. As the villages of Tanganyika eventually returned to normal, life resumed along the shores of Lake Victoria. Children played, markets reopened, and the sun rose and fell in its familiar rhythm. But the memory of uncontrollable laughter, carried collectively for weeks, remained etched in local consciousness. And for observers elsewhere, it posed an enduring question. How can the simplest of human expressions, laughter, become, under the right circumstances, something so inexplicably powerful? Perhaps the epidemic was nothing more than a mirror of societal tension, a momentary eruption of psychological pressure that left no trace beyond memory. Or perhaps, as some fringe theories hint, there were environmental or neurological factors we have yet to understand fully. Whatever the explanation, the Tanganyika laughter epidemic reminds us that history is not only made of wars, disasters, and political intrigue. it is also shaped by human experience in ways that can defy logic, measurement, and expectation. And so we are left to wonder, if a village can be overtaken by laughter so contagious and profound, what other subtle, collective phenomena may have occurred elsewhere, lost to record, observed only by those who experienced them, and waiting silently for history to notice? How many moments of inexplicable behavior, of emotional contagion magnified across communities, still lie hidden in the folds of our past, quietly challenging our understanding of human nature? And as the laughter of Tanganyika gradually subsided, leaving behind quiet villages and puzzled memories, the path of history draws us once again toward the sea, this time to a remote stretch of the Indian Ocean, where human ambition, isolation, and desperation combined in a tragedy that would be remembered not for natural forces, but for the darkness of human behavior. In the early morning of June 4th, 1629, the Dutch East India Company's ship Batavia struck a hidden reef near the Abrolhos Islands, off the western coast of what is now Australia. The ship's timbers groaned under the pressure, sails fluttered helplessly, and the first light revealed a jagged expanse of rocks and shallow waters. Survivors scrambled into small boats or clung to fragments of the wreckage, trying to escape the immediate danger. But the reef, unforgiving and isolated, transformed the accident into the prelude for something far more sinister. Of the hundreds aboard, only some reached the nearby islands, where fresh water was scarce and the environment harsh. Leadership fractured immediately. Geronimus Cornelis, the ship's under-merchant, assumed control in the vacuum of authority. What followed became one of the most chilling chapters in maritime history. Cornelis orchestrated a campaign of murder, eliminating those he saw as threats, consolidating power, and terrorizing survivors. Over the course of weeks, accounts suggest that perhaps 125 men, women, and children were killed, many executed deliberately, some left to die of deprivation. Historians have pieced together the events from trial records, survivors' testimony, and the meticulous logbooks of the Dutch East India Company. What emerges is a story of calculated cruelty. Cornelis was not merely violent. He applied strategy, isolating groups, exploiting fear, and using the physical geography of the islands to his advantage. The massacre was methodical, almost surgical, a grim example of how isolation and social collapse can amplify the darkest tendencies in human behavior. Yet even with this clarity, certain aspects remain elusive. Why did Cornelis, a trained merchant and former apothecary, transform so quickly from subordinate officer to murderer? Some suggest a combination of psychological predisposition and opportunity, a personality capable of manipulation finding a perfect storm in the chaos of a shipwreck. Others speculate that stress, fear, and the sudden breakdown of social hierarchy may have triggered an extreme form of mob-like behavior, magnified across the isolated community. The environment itself played a role. Stranded on a barren archipelago with limited food and water, the survivors faced immediate survival challenges. Tension would have been almost palpable, every decision carrying life or death consequences. How much of the horror was the product of premeditated cruelty, and how much was emergent from desperation, isolation, and the collapse of societal norms? Could ordinary people, placed in the right or wrong circumstances, descend into such organized brutality? Beyond psychology, some narratives hint at unexplained elements. Survivors recalled strange coincidences and narrow escapes. Small boats carrying the doomed being swept unexpectedly by currents, islands where threats seemed to gather in impossible proximity, and moments where the tide or reef altered the course of fate. Were these simply chance? Or did the geography itself shape the tragedy in ways that defy easy explanation? How much did the uncharted reefs, sudden storms, and invisible hazards of the islands dictate the outcome, forcing human cruelty into sharper relief? Even the rescue and aftermath carry a haunting resonance. The Dutch authorities dispatched ships to investigate months later. Cornelis and his followers were arrested and executed, yet the survivors returned to the mainland with stories that seemed almost surreal. A massacre upon a desert island, unfolding far from the reach of law, observed only by those who endured it. The trial records, while detailed, offer only partial insight into the mindset of the perpetrators. The magnitude of planning, patience, and cold calculation remains difficult to reconcile with ordinary understanding. Maritime archaeology has since attempted to locate remains of the ship and its scattered artifacts. Each discovery, rudimentary tools, fragments of rigging, or personal belongings, evokes the human presence that once stood on these islands, confronting death, isolation, and moral collapse. Objects remain silent witnesses to events that words can only partly capture. Could the silent reefs, the shifting sands, and the coral itself tell us more than written records? Or do they serve as a reminder that certain human actions leave traces that are almost impossible to fully interpret? Walking along the Abrolhos Islands today, one can feel the vast openness of the ocean, the sharp sting of wind carrying salt and sunlight, the quiet rhythm of waves breaking over reefs that have claimed countless vessels. Nothing immediately signals the horror that once unfolded here. And yet, history whispers through the sand and coral, about leadership corrupted by opportunity, about the fragility of order in isolated conditions, and about how quickly survival can transform into terror. The Batavia Shipwreck Massacre reminds us that tragedy can be both sudden and deliberate, human cruelty intertwined with misfortune. It also asks us to consider how we define morality under extreme circumstances, how society constrains behavior, and what happens when those constraints vanish. The sea may reclaim its victims, the reefs may remain unchanged, but the questions linger. How many other moments of maritime catastrophe concealed moral darkness waiting to be exposed? And how often does isolation reveal aspects of humanity we would rather not confront? In the shadows of the wreckage, in the bones of coral and scattered timber, history keeps its quiet record, inviting us to remember, not merely the events themselves, but the fragile boundary between survival, desperation, and the capacity for unspeakable acts. And as we trace the story of the Batavia, we are left to wonder, how much of history's darker side remains hidden, waiting for a moment when circumstance and choice converge in ways that continue to haunt us centuries later? And as the reefs of the Abrolhos Islands settle back into quiet under the endless rhythm of the ocean, the focus of our journey moves from the deliberate horrors of human cruelty to the hidden dangers of human innovation, forces that can erupt with devastating effect in the very heart of civilization. From isolated islands, we now travel north to the remote plains of the Ural Mountains, to a secretive corner of the Soviet Union, where a disaster quietly reshaped lives and landscapes, leaving a shadow that would linger for decades. In the early hours of September 29, 1957, an industrial complex near the small town of Kyshtym, located in Chelyabinsk Oblast, experienced a catastrophic event unlike anything publicly acknowledged at the time. The complex, known as Mayak, was a key site for the Soviet nuclear program, producing plutonium for weapons in a period when secrecy and political control overshadowed safety. The exact details of the facility were known only to insiders, and even today, many records remain classified. The disaster began with the overheating of a storage tank containing highly radioactive waste. Without proper cooling, the chemical compounds inside underwent a chemical explosion, releasing enormous amounts of radioactive material into the surrounding environment. According to later estimates, the release was on the order of tens of millions of curies, comparable to, in some ways, the fallout of the Chernobyl disaster decades later. Entire villages were contaminated, farmland became unsafe, Rivers and lakes carried invisible threats downstream, and the air itself became laden with a danger that could not be seen, tasted, or touched. Contemporary witnesses reported sudden illness, nausea, and skin irritation, though Soviet authorities suppressed details, moving quickly to evacuate some areas quietly and to obscure the scale of the disaster from public knowledge. Families were displaced without explanation. Farms were abandoned, crops left to wither, and livestock left to die or become unsafe. The term East Ural's radioactive trace was later used to describe the path of contamination, stretching over hundreds of kilometers, a scar upon the landscape that would endure for decades. Scientists analyzing the incident have noted that the disaster was a combination of mechanical failure, human error, and systemic secrecy. The storage protocols at Mayak were insufficient, the warning systems inadequate, and the pressure to maintain production relentless. The resulting explosion, while mechanical in origin, left human and ecological consequences that no engineering could easily contain. Yet even with modern studies, some aspects remain uncertain. How much radioactive material was actually released? How many people suffered in ways never recorded? And what long-term genetic and ecological effects have yet to fully manifest? Some researchers have explored more speculative dimensions of the disaster. Given the secretive nature of the Soviet nuclear program, there are unanswered questions about whether other facilities contributed to the environmental burden and whether similar near misses occurred elsewhere without documentation. Could patterns in ecological anomalies or unexplained illnesses in the region be tied to additional incidents? And to what extent did the political need for secrecy obscure lessons that might have prevented further tragedies? The human experience of the Kyshtym disaster is perhaps the most haunting element. Communities were uprooted, yet for many, the danger was invisible. Radioactive clouds drift silently, penetrating soil, water, and food supplies. Illnesses appeared months or years after exposure, confounding families who could see no immediate cause. In such conditions, fear becomes pervasive but intangible, a shadow without shape, a mystery encoded in whispers rather than records. Local folklore and anecdotal accounts describe strange occurrences. Forests where animals seemed absent, lakes with unusual chemical smells, or villagers noticing sudden crop failures despite unchanged weather patterns. While these may be partly explained by contamination, the fragmented and delayed nature of the disaster allowed the imagination to fill in gaps, creating stories of invisible forces lurking just beyond perception. The combination of secrecy and danger made reality feel almost mythic, a peril felt more than seen. From a modern perspective, the Kyshtym disaster also raises broader questions about the limits of technological ambition and the unintended consequences of innovation. Nuclear energy promised immense power but demanded meticulous management. When systems fail, the damage is not confined to a single factory or a single moment. It radiates outward, measured not only in immediate casualties, but in lingering uncertainty and environmental degradation. And yet, for much of the world, this event remained unknown for decades, as if history itself had chosen to conceal its lessons. Walking the affected regions today, the landscape bears muted reminders. Patches of forest show slower growth. Abandoned villages crumble quietly, reclaimed by nature. Radiation monitors, installed more recently, measure invisible threats, whispering of the past in numerical signals. Nothing dramatic, nothing overt. Yet the weight of the disaster lingers, a reminder that human error, secrecy, and ambition can combine to create tragedies that endure silently. The Kyshtym disaster stands as a portrait of quiet horror, an industrial event with consequences that ripple far beyond immediate understanding. It reminds us that some mysteries of history are not rooted in myth or human malice, but in the fragile balance between knowledge, power, and the natural world. And as we reflect on the invisible traces left behind, in soil, in water, in the bodies of those affected, we are left to wonder how many other moments, hidden by secrecy, obscured by politics, or encoded in science itself, remain waiting in history's shadows. And in the silence of the East Urals, where the air once carried danger unseen, the question persists: what else in our modern past, quietly unfolding, has left its mark upon the world, haunting us with consequences we are only beginning to understand? And as the poisoned silence of Kyshtym's wastelands slowly begins to fade in memory, we turn once more to Europe, to a place where human bodies themselves became instruments of inexplicable behavior, a city gripped not by fire or radiation, but by movement so relentless it defied explanation. From the remote Urals, the trail of history carries us westward, to the streets of Strasbourg in the year 1518, where joy and terror intertwined in a rhythm no one could escape. It began quietly, in the summer heat of July. Narrow streets wound through timber-framed houses, the scent of bread baking and river water drifting from the Ill River, mingling with the warmth of sunlit stone. But soon, an unusual sight appeared. A woman, seemingly ordinary, stepping into the square, her feet moving to a rhythm that no drumbeat had supplied. At first, passers-by paused, perhaps bemused, perhaps curious. Yet, as hours passed, her movement did not slow. She danced relentlessly, her body quivering, her face twisted with exhaustion and strain. Within days, more people joined. Scholars later estimated that dozens, then hundreds of citizens, men, women, and even children, were swept into the phenomenon. They danced without pause, some collapsing from fatigue, others continuing despite injuries and illness. The local authorities, bewildered, attempted to intervene, offering music and spaces in the hope that the motion might relieve them. When that failed, they permitted dancing in public squares, believing that allowing the phenomenon to run its course might prevent wider calamity. Yet the movement only intensified. Contemporary chronicles provide vivid, almost surreal detail. Physicians were summoned, religious figures preached, and city councils debated, yet no one could explain the cause. Some documented cases of death by exhaustion or stroke. Letters to neighboring towns carried accounts of a city caught in a trance of motion, its streets transformed into a stage of relentless, compulsive rhythm. Modern explanations remain varied and debated. Epidemiologists and psychologists suggest that the dancing plague may have been a form of mass psychogenic illness triggered by extreme stress, famine, or social tension in the city. Strasbourg, like much of Europe in the early 16th century, suffered from disease, poor harvests, and economic uncertainty. Could collective anxiety, channeled through an extraordinary human response, have created the perfect conditions for this shared compulsion? Yet other aspects resist conventional reasoning. Why did the behavior manifest as dancing rather than another form of expression? Why did it persist for weeks despite exhaustion and visible harm? Could toxins from contaminated rye, such as ergotism, have played a role? Fungal compounds known to cause convulsions and hallucinations? Even this chemical explanation cannot fully account for the social transmission of movement across hundreds of individuals. Something about the phenomenon seems to bridge physiology, psychology, and the inexplicable influence of communal behavior. Historians have also noted the striking responses of city authorities. They organized musicians and spaces for dancing in the hope of relieving the compulsion, yet this very act may have reinforced it. Could it be that observation and attention, combined with social expectation, acted as accelerants, turning an isolated case into a city-wide event? And if so, what does this reveal about the interaction between human perception, suggestion, and shared physical behavior? The human experience of the plague is haunting. Reports describe faces etched with fatigue, muscles cramping, and yet a compulsive drive to continue. Some danced to survive, others perhaps because the body had begun to respond independently of conscious will. Entire communities watched, horrified and powerless, as friends and relatives moved themselves toward collapse. It is a reminder of the fragility of control, the ways in which mind and body can diverge under pressure, and the thin line between ordinary behavior and extraordinary compulsion. Cultural and spiritual interpretation further complicated the episode. Many contemporaries saw divine wrath or supernatural influence at work. Clergy preached sermons, urging penitence, pilgrimage, and prayer, framing the dancing as punishment or warning. Others saw it as a test of endurance, a physical expression of collective guilt or fear. In a society deeply intertwined with religious meaning, such explanations shaped both perception and response, embedding the event in the city's memory far beyond the immediate physical effects. Walking through Strasbourg today, the streets seem serene. Cafes line the square, the river reflects sunlight on stone bridges, and life flows with ordinary rhythm. Yet, beneath the surface of modern life, the memory of 1518 lingers. Echoes of movement that seemed beyond choice, traces of human experience that defy straightforward explanation. Archaeologists, historians, and psychologists continue to study the period, seeking insight into the social, environmental, and physiological conditions that could give rise to such extraordinary behavior. The dancing plague invites reflection on the limits of understanding. When collective human behavior escapes immediate explanation, it forces us to confront the complexity of the mind, the body, and society itself. Was it stress, chemical exposure, spiritual fear, or some combination of factors yet unrecognized? Or does it hint at a broader truth? That history contains moments in which ordinary human existence collides with forces, psychological, social, or environmental, that transform the familiar into something almost mystical? As we retrace the steps of Strasbourg's afflicted citizens, the question remains: what unseen forces in times of crisis or pressure can sweep through communities, compelling bodies to move, act, and endure beyond reason? And how many other episodes in history, like the dancing plague, lie hidden in records and memory, quietly waiting for the observer to notice that sometimes the past moves in ways we cannot explain? And as the cobblestone streets of Strasbourg return to quiet, where dancers once moved beyond their own control, we turn now to a far quieter, yet no less unsettling stage. The small, Midwestern town of Mattoon, Illinois, in the mid-20th century, where a shadow moved unseen through the night, leaving fear in its wake. Unlike the visible horrors of shipwrecks or mass psychogenic illness, this mystery carried with it a sense of the intangible, an invisible threat, felt more than seen, haunting homes and the imagination of an entire community. In the summer of 1944, Mattoon appeared at first glance like any other American town. Streets were lined with modest homes, children played in yards, and neighbors exchanged greetings in the warm evening air. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, a strange phenomenon began to stir, something that would later be known as the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. Residents reported an odd Swedish smell like ether or gas lingering near windows and doors late at night. Those who inhaled it felt immediate and alarming effects: nausea, dizziness, difficulty breathing, and a sudden weakness in their limbs. The accounts began sporadically, a single household reporting symptoms, a neighbor confirming a similar sensation. Within weeks, dozens of reports surfaced. The strange attacks occurred at night, often in otherwise secure homes. Windows were tightly shut, doors locked, yet the symptoms continued. Panic spread quietly, amplified by the uncertainty of the phenomenon. Some described seeing a figure outside their homes, dark and fleeting, but no one could confirm a presence. The town, in its small, close-knit community, became gripped by suspicion and fear of an invisible assailant. Local authorities responded with investigation and caution. Police patrolled neighborhoods, yet no perpetrator was apprehended. No chemical analysis could identify a source. Newspapers published accounts, both alarming and skeptical, and the stories of the Gassers' attacks drew attention beyond the town itself. Some residents fortified their homes, sleeping in shifts, while others attempted to confront the unseen figure, to no avail. The attacks, unpredictable and intangible, created a persistent sense of vulnerability. Mainstream explanations have focused on psychological and social dynamics. Psychologists suggest the events may have been a case of mass hysteria, where fear, suggestion, and social contagion amplified ordinary stimuli into perceived attacks. In a small community, especially during wartime with the shadow of global conflict pressing on the collective consciousness, stress and rumor could magnify every creak of a floorboard, every faint odor, into evidence of a malevolent presence. Yet, as always, the accounts resist simple explanation. Some victims described very real physical effects: temporary paralysis, vomiting, and fainting. Neighbors corroborated the timing of attacks. Could it have been a chemical agent, perhaps experimental or accidental, released intentionally or otherwise? There is no definitive proof, and no body or instrument has ever been found. The Mad Gasser remains as elusive as the ether-like odor itself, an anomaly that leaves more questions than answers. Even the social dimension adds complexity. Residents spoke of tension between families, suspicion toward outsiders, and the quiet policing of community boundaries. Could the Gasser have been a single individual, exploiting fear and opportunity? Or was it the town's collective nervous energy, manifesting as a shared experience of attack, where the imagination itself became a kind of weapon? In these questions, the mystery deepens rather than resolves. There are whispers of fringe explanations, of chemical experimentation gone wrong, or secret wartime research leaking into civilian areas. Others speculate about environmental factors, fumes from industrial plants, natural gases from soil, or even interactions of household chemicals exacerbated by humidity and heat. Yet none of these explanations account fully for the patterns, timing, and intensity of reported attacks. Some victims were taken to doctors, others fainted in homes with no apparent chemical presence. The phenomenon occupies that narrow space between the physical and the perceptual, where historical events resist the clear lines of explanation. Walking through modern-day Mattoon, the streets and homes appear calm, ordinary, almost idyllic. The gas attacks, the fear, the fleeting glimpses of a figure moving in the night, all have receded into memory, newspaper clippings, and retellings passed down by residents and historians. And yet, the story of the Mad Gasser endures, a reminder that danger does not always announce itself, that some events elude measurement and analysis, and that fear can take on a life of its own when amplified by community, circumstance, and the unknown. The phenomenon also invites reflection on the nature of human perception. How much of what we experience is shaped by environment, expectation, and shared imagination? When invisible forces, or what we perceive as such, enter daily life, the mind may interpret subtle stimuli as deliberate threat. And when an entire town shares similar experiences, the boundary between fact and collective perception blurs. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon is a story without closure. Unlike disasters or epidemics, there are no victims fully accounted for by science, no artifact left behind, no culprit named. And yet, the traces remain, in local memory, in newspaper archives, in the lingering questions about what invisible threat could paralyze a town without leaving proof. And so we are left to ponder. Was the gasser a person, a chemical anomaly, or a phenomenon born from the fears and expectations of the time? And how many other moments in history, quiet and strange, have slipped between certainty and imagination, leaving only whispers, unexplained symptoms, and the enduring shadow of what might have been? And as the quiet streets of Mattoon slowly returned to their ordinary rhythms, leaving behind the lingering fear of an invisible predator, history once again draws us into a realm of unseen danger, this time stretching back nearly 2 millennia across the cities and trade routes of the Roman Empire. Here, in the heart of urban centers and rural settlements alike, a silent, invisible threat spread with a speed and ferocity that would leave an indelible mark on the ancient world: the Plague of Cyprian. The year was approximately 249 AD. Across the Mediterranean basin, cities hummed with commerce, religion, and civic life. In Rome, the streets were alive with merchants, citizens, and the echoing footsteps of soldiers. Markets overflowed with goods from Egypt, Gaul, and distant provinces. Ships traveled the Adriatic and Aegean. Temples and baths drew crowds daily. And yet, beneath this ordinary bustle, an invisible shadow began to move. Reports describe sudden fevers, vomiting, and relentless diarrhea, followed by widespread weakness and internal bleeding. Some accounts speak of eyes reddened, mouths foaming, and bodies racked by convulsions. Contemporary observers, including the Christian bishop Cyprian of Carthage, documented a society brought to the edge of collapse. Children dying, parents succumbing beside them, and the living overwhelmed by the fear of the unseen. Cyprian described a world in which commerce stalled, civic order faltered, and death could arrive at any doorstep, at any hour. The plague's origin remains uncertain. Modern epidemiologists have debated possible culprits: smallpox, measles, viral hemorrhagic fevers, or combinations of pathogens exacerbated by malnutrition and social disruption. Some suggest that the empire's extensive trade routes accelerated transmission, carrying disease from Africa, Asia, and the eastern Mediterranean into densely populated urban centers. Yet even today, the precise nature of the pathogen remains a matter of speculation, leaving the Plague of Cyprian as one of history's most enduring medical mysteries. Contemporary accounts emphasize the psychological as much as the physical. Cyprian wrote of despair, noting how communities abandoned the sick, while others moved among the dying with a sense of inevitability, performing acts of care that risked their own lives. Fear transformed the social fabric. Families broke apart, commerce slowed, and public gatherings became fraught with danger. How does a civilization endure when the very air seems to carry death? How do societies adapt when the boundaries between health and peril vanish entirely? The historical context offers additional insight. Rome was already grappling with political instability, economic strain, and military pressure from outside its borders. The plague intensified these vulnerabilities, amplifying existing fears and exposing the fragility of empire. Soldiers were debilitated, food production disrupted, and civic rituals, including funerals and religious observances, interrupted. Did these societal stresses exacerbate the physical effects of the disease, creating a feedback loop in which fear, mortality, and social collapse reinforced one another? Yet the human responses to the plague also suggest resilience and adaptation. Communities sought refuge in religious faith, interpreting the plague as divine punishment or a call to moral reflection. Some fled urban centers for rural sanctuaries. Others tended to the sick despite personal risk. These acts, recorded in letters and treatises, provide a counterpoint to the despair, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humans navigate both fear and compassion. Modern science has attempted to reconstruct the plague of Cyprian's epidemiology through careful analysis of historical texts and comparative study of known pathogens. Hypotheses abound, from viral hemorrhagic fevers with high mortality to unprecedented strains of smallpox. Yet without physical remains or preserved pathogen samples, certainty remains elusive. This uncertainty adds to the haunting quality of the event, a plague that reshaped the Roman world, yet whose precise nature remains beyond definitive comprehension. The Plague of Cyprian also highlights a broader pattern in human history, the way invisible threats can disrupt society more profoundly than visible ones. Unlike wars or earthquakes, which leave physical scars, disease leaves traces in documents, demographic shifts, and collective memory. The absence of certainty, the inability to pinpoint origin, transmission, or exact cause, creates a space for both scientific investigation and speculation, bridging history, medicine, and the human imagination. Walking through ancient sites like Carthage, Rome, or Alexandria today, one can still sense the rhythm of human life that once existed. Markets bustling, temples echoing, streets crowded with children and merchants. Yet, beneath the stone and dust, the memory of an epidemic persists. The silent, invisible force that could undo a civilization in months, leaving the living to navigate grief, fear, and uncertainty. The Plague of Cyprian invites reflection on the fragility of human societies in the face of unseen threats. How much of our own history has been shaped by forces we cannot perceive directly? How often have epidemics gone unrecorded, yet left their mark on populations, economies, and culture? And even now, as we study pathogens, mortality, and human resilience, what aspects of ancient epidemics remain hidden, waiting for careful analysis, interpretation, or simply the passage of time to reveal their secrets? In the end, the Plague of Cyprian is more than a historical event. It is a reminder that human life, even in the most sophisticated civilizations, exists in tension with the unseen. It is a story of mortality, adaptation, and the limits of knowledge, a chapter in history that continues to haunt, urging us to wonder not only about the past, but also about what mysteries, invisible and unmeasured, might still lie in the shadows of human existence. And as the Plague of Cyprian swept across the Mediterranean, leaving cities emptied and societies strained, history turns next to a city once teeming with life, wealth, and devotion. A place now frozen in silence, its walls crumbling yet resonant with memory. From the invisible menace of disease, we move to a tangible landscape of abandonment, where human exodus created a mystery that endures across centuries. The dead city of Ani. Perched on the rugged hills of what is now eastern Turkey, near the borderlands with Armenia, Ani was once known as the City of 1,001 Churches. From a distance, the city appears as a stone labyrinth suspended between cliffs, with the remains of cathedrals, fortifications, and bustling marketplaces whispering of grandeur long past. The Arpa River winds below, carving deep channels that both protected and isolated the settlement, while the surrounding plains stretch endlessly toward the horizon, a testament to the strategic and fertile lands that once sustained a thriving civilization. In the 10th and 11th centuries, Ani was a jewel of the Armenian kingdom, a hub of trade, religion, and culture. Its streets were filled with merchants from across the Silk Road, the clatter of carts mingling with the calls of market vendors, the scent of spices, and the murmur of scholars debating philosophy and scripture. At its height, Ani's population may have numbered tens of thousands, and its architecture reflected both the ambition and wealth of its inhabitants, grand churches, palaces, and fortresses that conveyed power, piety, and permanence. Yet the city that once radiated life is now silent. By the late Middle Ages, Ani had been abandoned, its people scattered by waves of conquest, natural disaster, and economic decline. The Exodus is a story partially told in chronicles and archaeological evidence, yet its full causes remain enigmatic. Earthquakes repeatedly shook the region, weakening structures and destabilizing the city. Invasions by Seljuk Turks, Mongols, and other armies repeatedly disrupted trade and security. Plagues, too, likely contributed to population decline, compounding a fragile social and economic network. But why Ani, once so resilient, succumbed so completely, leaving no permanent population, continues to provoke questions. The mystery deepens when one considers the speed and completeness of the exodus. Streets, homes, and sacred spaces were abandoned in a pattern that suggests both urgency and planning. Artifacts left behind, tools, household items, and religious objects, indicate that residents departed suddenly, yet systematically. Did they flee imminent danger, or did successive waves of stress gradually depopulate the city? Was Ani's abandonment primarily human choice, or were there invisible pressures, famine, disease, climate shifts, that rendered continued habitation untenable? Archaeologists and historians have offered several explanations. The geopolitical vulnerability of Ani, perched between empires and trade routes, made it a target for conquest. Economic disruption may have undermined the city's ability to support its population. Recurrent earthquakes weakened infrastructure, making both defense and daily life precarious. And yet, even with these factors, the scale of abandonment remains striking. Unlike cities that decline gradually, Ani's depopulation was profound, leaving a landscape that would not be permanently re-inhabited. Environmental factors may also have played a hidden role. Some researchers suggest that shifts in climate and river patterns reduced agricultural yield, making sustained settlement increasingly difficult. Others point to seismic activity as a continual threat, each tremor weakening walls and bridges, creating a psychological and physical environment in which long-term residence became untenable. Could the combination of human ambition, environmental fragility, and geopolitical pressure have produced a tipping point, compelling tens of thousands to leave behind homes and history in a single irreversible wave? The city's architecture amplifies the mystery. Even in ruin, the stone walls, domes, and arches communicate sophistication and permanence. Churches stand partially intact, intricate carvings etched into walls, frescoes faded but discernible, as if Ani's former inhabitants had attempted to create a city immune to time, and yet time and circumstance proved relentless. The juxtaposition of human ingenuity and impermanence, the silent streets, the empty marketplaces, is haunting. How could a city so carefully constructed and culturally vibrant be evacuated so completely? Walking through Ani today, the wind carries the echo of footsteps long gone. Stairs lead to nowhere, arches frame empty skies, and the Arpa River glimmers beneath crumbling bridges. The city's isolation, once a strategic advantage, now emphasizes the absence of life. Scholars explore the ruins, piecing together stories from inscriptions, foundations, and fragments of daily life. Yet the exodus remains partially unknowable. The motivations, fears, and experiences of Ani's final residents are inaccessible, lost to the silence of centuries. The dead city of Ani prompts reflection on the fragility of human endeavor. Civilization can flourish, reach extraordinary heights, and yet remain vulnerable to the converging forces of nature, politics, and human choice. Ani reminds us that even the most permanent structures are contingent on social cohesion, environmental stability, and historical circumstance. And as we study its ruins, we are left to wonder, what precisely compelled its inhabitants to abandon homes, churches, and marketplaces? What unrecorded stories lie beneath the rubble, waiting to reveal why one of history's great cities became a ghostly testament to the transience of human achievement? Ani's silence continues to speak, Its empty streets and crumbling domes ask questions that historians, archaeologists, and travelers alike cannot fully answer. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson of the dead city. History is not always explained, and sometimes the greatest mysteries lie not in what remains, but in what was lost, frozen in time, waiting for the observer to imagine the lives, hopes, and fears that vanished along with the city itself. And as the silent streets of Ani lie in their centuries-long quiet, their empty churches and marketplaces reminding us of humanity's fragile imprint on history, we turn next to a smaller yet no less haunting story of societal tension and human behavior, one that unfolds not in the ruins of an abandoned city, but in the bustling heart of 18th century Paris. Here, in narrow streets and crowded workshops, a peculiar and grim event would reveal the darker edges of human psychology: the Great Cat Massacre. The setting is vividly domestic, yet industrial. Paris, in the 1730s, was a city of artisans, workshops, and small-scale manufacturing. The streets smelled of wood smoke and baking bread, carts clattered over cobblestones, and the rhythmic pounding of hammers echoed from workshops where master craftsmen and their journeymen produced goods for an eager urban population. Cats prowled the streets, the alleyways, and the shops, hunting vermin and maintaining a balance that human eyes might barely notice, yet which was crucial to daily life. And yet, in these workshops, a peculiar phenomenon arose. In a series of coordinated actions, journeymen, young men employed under strict masters, turned their attention to the animals that shared their workplaces. Cats, usually ignored or tolerated, were rounded up and killed. Contemporary accounts describe an almost ritualistic quality to the event. The animals were pursued systematically, their deaths carried out with grim precision, and the act seemed, to outside observers, both shocking and incomprehensible. Historians have interpreted the massacre in multiple ways. Some see it as an expression of class tension. Journeymen, constrained by harsh labor conditions, low wages, and strict masters, redirected their frustrations onto the animals of the household. Cats, which were both tolerated and pampered by masters, became symbols of authority and control, innocent victims through which the powerless could exert a measure of agency. Could the act have served as a form of psychological relief, a momentary inversion of power within a rigid social hierarchy? Other interpretations focus on cultural symbolism. Cats in Parisian society were sometimes associated with superstition, witchcraft, or moral laxity. By targeting them, the journeyman may have been participating in an act that combined rebellion, ritual, and a strange sense of morality. A dark mirror reflecting the anxieties and contradictions of their world. And yet, while cultural or symbolic explanations provide context, they cannot fully account for the intensity, coordination, and repetition of the killings. The human dimension is equally compelling. Witnesses reported that the young workers displayed a mixture of excitement, fear, and grim satisfaction. Emotions that suggest a complex interplay between collective behavior, social psychology, and individual impulse. The act was both communal and secretive. It drew participants together while simultaneously threatening social norms and moral boundaries. How could a routine workshop, filled with tools, commerce, and everyday labor, transform into a stage for such an extraordinary event? And why did the act leave a lasting imprint on memory, becoming a subject of chroniclers and historians alike? The broader context of Paris in the 18th century provides additional layers to the mystery. Economic instability, rigid guild systems, and the pressures of apprenticeship created environments of tension and competition. Journeymen often lived in overcrowded quarters, worked long hours, and were subject to strict hierarchical discipline. Could the massacre have been, in part, a form of psychological escape, a way to reclaim agency in a world defined by limitation and control? Or does it suggest something more enigmatic, a ritualized expression of human aggression filtered through the lens of animal targets? Even today, scholars debate whether the event was anomalous or indicative of larger social patterns. Was it an isolated outbreak of cruelty, or a ritualistic expression of class and cultural dynamics present in many cities, yet rarely recorded? Did the victim's small, silent forms allow participants to confront fear and power in a contained, controlled manner, revealing something about human tendencies toward violence and symbolic action? Walking through modern Paris, it is difficult to imagine the workshops of the 18th century. The clatter of hammer on metal, the scent of sawdust, the quiet stalking of cats among the streets. These traces have been absorbed into the city's layered history. Yet the Great Cat Massacre leaves a spectral presence. It reminds us that human behavior can manifest in unexpected and morally challenging ways, that the dynamics of power, frustration, and collective action are as old as urban society itself, and that even seemingly minor events can illuminate profound truths about the past. The massacre also invites reflection on morality, perception, and memory. Why do some acts endure in historical consciousness while others vanish? How do we interpret events that straddle the line between social explanation and the inexplicable, between routine life and ritualized cruelty? And when we confront these moments, what do they reveal about the societies that produced them and the humans who lived within them? The Great Cat Massacre, though distant in time and peculiar in detail, endures as a story of tension, psychology, and human behavior. It is a reminder that history is shaped not only by wars, empires, or plagues, but also by smaller, more intimate acts that reveal the contours of fear, frustration, and agency. And as we consider the silent streets of Paris, the empty workshops, and the shadows where cats once prowled, we are left to wonder, how many other moments of subtle yet profound disruption have been lost to memory? And what can they teach us about the darkness and complexity of human experience? And as Parisian workshops return to their ordinary rhythm, leaving behind the unsettling echoes of the Great Cat Massacre, history beckons us once again to a phenomenon where the body itself becomes a vessel for mystery, a place where joy, terror, and compulsion converge in ways that elude simple explanation. From the cobblestones of Paris, we travel to the city of Aachen, in what is now Western Germany, where in the early 14th century, a citywide phenomenon would grip its citizens in inexplicable motion: the dancing mania of Aachen. The setting is unmistakably vivid. Aachen, with its Romanesque architecture, narrow winding streets, and the imposing silhouette of its cathedral, was a bustling city at the crossroads of trade and pilgrimage. The scent of fresh bread mingled with the smoke of hearths. Merchants called across crowded markets, while travelers and pilgrims from across Europe filled the squares. Yet beneath the ordinary bustle, something strange began to unfold, something that would transform everyday life into an extraordinary spectacle of movement, endurance, and mystery. It began in the summer of 1374. A handful of citizens reportedly began to dance uncontrollably in the streets, at first for brief periods, then for hours, as if their bodies had surrendered to an unseen force. Witnesses described scenes that defied comprehension: men and women moving with relentless energy, faces flushed, eyes wide, muscles trembling from exhaustion. Some collapsed only to rise again. Others were carried away, yet continued the rhythmic, frenzied motion. The compulsion spread, drawing dozens, then hundreds, into its strange grip. Contemporary accounts, preserved in municipal records and chronicles, describe the phenomenon with both fascination and horror. Physicians and clergy attempted intervention, offering prayers, music, and remedies, yet the dancing persisted. Those affected often experienced severe physical distress, dehydration, exhaustion, and in some cases, death from overexertion. Yet the underlying cause remained elusive, leaving city authorities perplexed and residents terrified. How could an entire population, for reasons no one could understand, become possessed by such relentless movement? Modern historians and medical experts have offered various explanations. Some suggest a form of mass psychogenic illness, a social and psychological contagion triggered by stress, famine, or disease. The 14th century was a period of immense hardship. Repeated outbreaks of plague, harsh winters, economic instability, and social unrest created conditions ripe for communal psychological phenomena. Could the collective mind, under extreme pressure, have found release through bodily compulsion, transforming anxiety and fear into rhythmic motion? Others propose more physiological theories. Some researchers speculate that food contamination, ergotism caused by a fungus on rye for instance, could have induced convulsions, hallucinations, and tremors mistaken for compulsive dancing. While ergotism could account for some physical symptoms, it cannot entirely explain the social transmission of the behavior, the gatherings of large crowds, or the apparent contagious nature of the mania. Something about the phenomenon exists at the intersection of mind, body, and community, a convergence that defies simple categorization. The human element adds layers of complexity. The mania did not affect all citizens equally. Children and young adults were particularly susceptible, yet elders and authorities sometimes joined or attempted to restrain participants. Some scholars suggest that religious fervor and societal pressures amplified the response. Aachen was a city of pilgrimage, where spiritual expectation and communal ritual held powerful sway. Could the mania have been interpreted by participants as divine compulsion, or bystanders as moral punishment? And if so, how did belief and fear shape the physical reality of the phenomenon? The social and cultural impact was profound. Markets were abandoned, civic routines disrupted, and public gatherings transformed into stages of uncontrollable motion. Citizens watched as friends, neighbors, and strangers surrendered to forces they could neither measure nor control. Could the dancing have functioned as a release valve for collective tension, a socially mediated form of coping with trauma and scarcity? Or was it a symptom of a more mysterious, unexplained force, an event that eludes scientific categorization even today? Walking through Aachen in the present day, the cathedral's towers and cobblestone streets carry a quiet grandeur, yet the memory of those summer days lingers invisibly. The streets that once teemed with frantic motion now echo with the imagination of historians and scholars seeking to understand the mechanics of mass behavior. Archaeological traces offer little, and written records provide only partial insight into the lived experience. And yet, the phenomenon persists in memory as a reminder that human bodies and minds can respond to forces, psychological, social, or environmental, that remain partially unknown. The dancing mania of Aachen invites reflection on the vulnerability of human communities to unseen pressures. When fear, stress, and social dynamics converge, what latent capacities lie dormant within individuals and groups? How often might collective behavior, seemingly inexplicable, reflect deep-seated anxieties amplified by circumstance? And what does it reveal about the thin boundary between voluntary action and compulsion, between the conscious and the uncontrollable? In the end, the dancing mania is more than an episode of historical curiosity. It is a window into the complex interplay of mind, body, and society. A phenomenon in which ordinary life becomes extraordinary, where streets transform into arenas of mystery, and where the forces that shape human behavior remain partially hidden, waiting for careful observation and reflection. And as we imagine the streets of Aachen filled with motion, we are left with an enduring question. What other episodes of mass human compulsion, fear, or fervor have been lost to history? And what do they tell us about the unseen currents that move communities, silently shaping the human story? And as the streets of Aachen fell silent after the strange, compulsive rhythms of the dancing mania, the flow of history leads us now to another site of haunting human violence, one less visible in the annals of world history, yet no less chilling in its implications. From the cobblestones of medieval Europe, we cross continents and centuries to the northern plains of India, to the small town of Ajnala in what is now Punjab, where a massacre unfolded that left an indelible mark upon the land and memory of its people. The Ajnala Well Massacre. The landscape is deceptively tranquil. The fields stretch green and flat under the open sky, punctuated by clusters of trees and low-lying structures, with the distant silhouette of a town on the horizon. In the midst of this pastoral setting lies a well, unassuming yet central to the events that would make Ajnala infamous. It is here, historians would later discover, that the bodies of hundreds were deposited, silent witnesses to a moment of calculated cruelty that would linger in local memory for over a century, buried beneath the soil and obscured by the passage of time. The events occurred in 1857, during a period of intense upheaval in northern India. The Indian Rebellion, often referred to as the First War of Independence, had erupted, fueled by discontent against the British East India Company's rule, cultural disrespect, and economic exploitation. In the Punjab region, soldiers of the Bengal Army, alongside local insurgents, rose against the colonial authorities. The response from the British was swift, brutal, and in many cases indiscriminate. The town of Ajnala became a focal point of retaliation, its people caught between resistance and reprisal. Accounts suggest that after a skirmish in the area, hundreds of Indian soldiers, referred to in some reports as sepoys, were captured by British forces. In a demonstration of power and intimidation, these prisoners were executed in an unusually gruesome manner. Many were shot or beaten, then thrown into the well at Ajnala. Local oral histories describe a well so full of bodies that the water itself darkened with death, an image simultaneously horrifying and almost surreal in its scope. For decades, the well remained sealed and largely forgotten, a silent repository of human violence, its existence acknowledged only in whispers and local memory. The British records of the event are sparse, reflecting a pattern of suppression, minimization, or bureaucratic obfuscation that was common during the colonial administration. Local accounts, passed down orally and occasionally recorded by historians, provide a more vivid and disturbing picture. Estimates of the dead range from hundreds to over 1,000, men, and sometimes women, forced into darkness by both bullets and bureaucracy. Archaeologists in the 20th and 21st centuries would uncover human remains, confirming that the site indeed held evidence of mass execution, but many questions remain unresolved. Why was the well chosen as the site of execution? Some historians suggest that it was symbolic. A well, a source of life, transformed into a receptacle of death, a grim reversal meant to send a message to the surrounding population. Others argue that it was a practical choice, a way to dispose of bodies quickly and efficiently while simultaneously intimidating the local community. Yet the full motives, strategic, symbolic, or both, remain elusive, leaving the massacre suspended between calculated strategy and inexplicable cruelty. The human dimension is perhaps the most haunting. Families were left with no knowledge of their loved ones' fates. Communities were terrorized, their social fabric disrupted by grief, fear, and uncertainty. The well itself became a silent witness, a repository not only of human bodies, but also of unrecorded trauma, of stories lost to official record but preserved in memory. What must it have been like for those who survived, for those who knew what had occurred, yet could neither intervene nor commemorate the dead for generations? The Ajnala Well Massacre also raises broader questions about historical memory. Why do some events, despite their scale and horror, remain relatively unknown outside local or specialized scholarship. How does the suppression of records, deliberate or accidental, shape our understanding of history? And what does it mean that in 2011, over 150 years later, human remains were excavated from the site, confirming oral traditions long dismissed or forgotten? The interplay between recorded history and lived memory adds a layer of mystery and ethical reflection that continues to resonate. Speculative interpretations have emerged, though none are definitively proven. Some local narratives suggest that the well itself carries a lingering presence, an echo of injustice felt by the living, a place avoided, whispered about, yet never fully understood. Others emphasize the psychological and cultural impact, that the act of sealing life in darkness, of consigning it to the depths, leaves a collective imprint that persists across generations. And while the well is no longer sealed, the echoes of what occurred there, fear, grief, and outrage, remain invisible yet palpable, challenging historians and observers to reconcile physical evidence with human memory. Walking through modern-day Ajnala, the town appears serene, the fields quiet, the well unremarkable to the casual observer. Yet the past asserts itself in subtle ways. The alignment of stones, the stories carried through generations, and the knowledge that beneath the earth lies the testimony of hundreds of lives extinguished in a single, concentrated act of violence. History, in this sense, is tangible yet mysterious, measurable yet elusive, its lessons encoded not only in records, but in landscapes, memory, and the silence of sites like the Ajnala well. The massacre invites reflection on the nature of human cruelty, resilience, and historical obscurity. What drives one group to commit such acts, and what forces allow them to remain unacknowledged for generations? How do survivors, descendants, and later societies come to terms with events so sudden, deliberate, and devastating? And in the act of uncovering, examining, and remembering, what responsibilities do we inherit as observers, historians, and witnesses to these shadows of the past? The Ajnala well massacre remains, in many ways, unresolved. Archaeological evidence provides confirmation, yet interpretation, context, and understanding are ongoing challenges. It stands as a stark reminder that history is not only shaped by great battles, political maneuvering, or public spectacle, but also by acts of violence whose victims are rendered invisible, their suffering deposited into silence for decades, if not centuries. And as we peer into the depths of the well today, we are compelled to ask, how many other tragedies lie hidden, quietly shaping memory and morality, waiting for history to uncover them, and for us to confront the truths they hold? And as the shadow of the Ajnala well massacre slowly recedes into memory, leaving behind the weight of silenced voices and unmarked graves, we move once more into the heart of Europe, to a city whose cobbled streets and timbered houses would become the stage for fear, superstition, and the persecution of the most vulnerable, Leipzig. Here, in the late 17th century, a chilling chapter unfolded in which children, innocent in age, yet accused of dark complicity, became the focus of suspicion, interrogation, and terror. These were the Leipzig child witch trials. Leipzig, then a bustling center of trade, learning, and culture in Saxony, bore the usual hallmarks of a prosperous city. The market square alive with merchants' cries, the scent of baked bread and burning hearths mingling with river mist, the university attracting scholars from across the German-speaking world. Yet beneath this veneer of civic life, anxieties, spiritual, social, and political, festered. Europe, in the aftermath of wars, famine, and plague, remained preoccupied with the unseen forces believed to shape daily life: misfortune, disease, and moral corruption. The trials began in 1692. when allegations emerged that children in Leipzig were engaging in witchcraft, consorting with demons, or practicing malevolent magic. Unlike the more familiar accusations targeting adult women, these cases drew attention precisely because they involved children, some as young as 8 or 9. The accusations themselves were startling. Theft, malice, and even murder were attributed to young hands supposedly guided by supernatural influence. Communities, already strained by scarcity and social tension, turned toward the courts for explanation and resolution. Court records, still partially preserved, describe interrogations conducted with both diligence and fear. Children were questioned about pacts with the devil, attendance at secret nocturnal gatherings, and knowledge of curses. Some spoke freely of their alleged involvement, while others resisted or recanted under pressure. Methods intended to discern truth, ranging from observation of confession patterns to rudimentary tests of guilt, reflect a society struggling to reconcile extraordinary claims with ordinary logic. The juxtaposition of innocence and malevolence creates a haunting tension. How could children, embodiments of vulnerability, be implicated in the very acts that society feared most? Historical interpretation provides several perspectives. One suggests that the accusations were a manifestation of communal anxiety, projected onto those least able to defend themselves. Children, already marginalized in legal and social hierarchies, became convenient vessels for adult fears of moral and spiritual contamination. In a city grappling with economic pressures, social hierarchy, and religious orthodoxy, the leap from misbehavior to witchcraft was perhaps smaller than it appears to modern sensibilities. Could the trials have functioned as a societal mechanism, channeling collective unease into a framework of legal and ritualized containment? Other analyses focus on the psychological and social dynamics within families and communities. Jealousies, rivalries, and tensions between households may have fueled accusations, while adult authorities, teachers, parents, magistrates, exerted pressure that both shaped testimony and magnified fear. In this light, the child witches were not autonomous agents of evil, but participants in a web of influence, suggestion, and coercion, their confessions a mirror of the adult anxieties surrounding them. And yet, even when viewed through this lens, the events remain deeply unsettling. The manipulation of innocence, the formalization of fear into legal procedure, and the cultural readiness to believe in malevolent supernatural forces all contribute to a haunting tableau. Physical evidence is scarce. Unlike other mass events, the Leipzig trials left few artifacts beyond court records, testimonies, and fragments of local lore. Houses, schools, and streets that once witnessed accusations now appear ordinary, their surfaces erasing the traces of fear, pain, and societal panic. But the psychological imprint remains. The trials illuminate the ways in which human societies construct and enforce boundaries between innocence and corruption, knowledge and superstition, safety and danger. The child witches' stories raise further questions about historical memory. How did communities reconcile these events in the years that followed? How did surviving children, their families, and the wider citizenry integrate trauma, shame, and relief after accusations subsided? And why does this chapter remain less visible in popular history than other witchcraft persecutions, despite its singular and disturbing character? The tension between historical record and lived experience is palpable, leaving room for speculation as to the long-term social and psychological effects on the city of Leipzig. Speculative theories have emerged, though they are necessarily tentative. Some historians suggest that extreme climatic, economic, and epidemiological pressures, harsh winters, poor harvests, and residual plague outbreaks may have heightened communal stress, making supernatural explanations more plausible. Others point to social contagion, fear, rumor, and observation of peer behavior, creating self-reinforcing cycles in which children themselves internalized and enacted the accusations. Could there have been a mixture of actual mischief, performative confessions, and communal hysteria, all magnified by a legal system eager to assign blame and restore order? The lines between fact, perception, and superstition blur in ways that continue to challenge understanding. Walking through modern Leipzig today, the city seems vibrant and cultured. University students, marketplaces, cafes, and festivals imbue its streets with life. Yet one can imagine, beneath the cobblestones and the hum of contemporary life, echoes of earlier anxieties. Narrow alleys that once witnessed interrogation, homes that sheltered fearful families, and the quiet spaces where children were questioned. These traces linger invisibly, a reminder of the fragile line between societal order and communal panic, between belief and evidence. The Leipzig child witch trials force reflection on the intersection of innocence, fear, and authority. How do communities determine guilt in the absence of clear evidence? How can collective anxiety transform ordinary misbehavior into perceived acts of malice? And perhaps most troublingly, how many voices, silenced by time and circumstance, remain unheard, leaving only speculation to fill the void? Ultimately, the trials serve as a mirror to human societies, to our capacity for fear, for projection, and for creating narratives that explain uncertainty. The children of Leipzig were at once actors and victims, their lives caught in a confluence of societal pressures, spiritual belief, and historical circumstance. Their stories remain unresolved, hovering at the edge of comprehension, inviting us to ponder not only the mechanics of fear and accusation, but also the limits of historical understanding itself. As we trace the streets, the schools, and the echoes of those long-ago interrogations, the question remains: how often has fear shaped the course of events, particularly when it targets the most vulnerable? And in the quiet spaces of memory, law, and scholarship, what secrets of human belief, suspicion, and societal tension continue to wait, unsolved and enigmatic, ready to challenge our understanding of history itself? And as the echoes of fear and suspicion fade from Leipzig's cobblestone streets, giving way to the modern hum of academic life, history once again leads us to a place where silence itself becomes a tool, a presence, and a source of mystery. From the courts and alleys of 17th century Europe, we journey thousands of kilometers northeast to the frozen expanse of Siberia, to the industrial city of Norilsk, a place of extreme climate, harsh isolation, and a story whispered more than it is openly discussed. The Norilsk Silence Order. Norilsk lies above the Arctic Circle, where winter dominates the calendar, and the sun disappears entirely for weeks at a time, leaving the city under a thick, unbroken shroud of twilight. Temperatures plunge, rivers freeze, and the wind slices across endless tundra and the jagged ridges of the Putarana Plateau. The city itself is an industrial hub, built during the Soviet era, its skyline dominated by the towers of smelting plants and the utilitarian structures of a workforce drawn from across the nation, some by choice, many by decree. In this extreme landscape, human activity is constrained not only by geography, but by the weight of secrecy and control. The story begins in the mid-20th century, during the height of Soviet industrial expansion. Norilsk, remote and strategically vital for its nickel, copper, and palladium production, was heavily guarded and strictly regulated. Residents lived under conditions of isolation that few elsewhere could imagine. Limited contact with the outside world, harsh labor expectations, and strict oversight by state authorities. Yet within this environment emerged reports, officially sparse, partially suppressed, and sometimes contradictory, of an extraordinary decree, an order of enforced silence. The Norilsk Silence Order was said to govern not only communication about certain industrial operations, but also the circulation of information among residents themselves. Workers were instructed not to speak about incidents, accidents, or even daily occurrences that might draw attention to safety violations, environmental hazards, or labor unrest. Records were fragmented, and the details of enforcement remain uncertain, but testimony from former inhabitants suggests a pervasive atmosphere of caution, fear, and hypervigilance. In Norilsk, silence was both survival strategy and instrument of control. Historical documentation confirms some of the structural realities of life under these conditions. The city was largely dependent on gulag labor, with prisoners working under brutal conditions in mines and smelting plants. Official reports were minimal, often sanitized or contradictory, leaving gaps in understanding accidents, industrial failures, or the true scale of human cost. Could the so-called silence order have been a formal directive, or was it more of an unspoken rule, a combination of bureaucratic suppression and social pressure that ensured conformity and obedience? The line between documented policy and lived experience becomes almost imperceptible. Yet there is more than bureaucratic or industrial rationale at play. Witnesses describe the psychological dimensions of life in Norilsk, the quiet that settled over workers during long nights, the unbroken darkness of polar winter, and the sense that one could never fully articulate misfortune without consequence. The enforced restraint created a climate in which rumor, speculation, and fear flourished, filling the void left by forbidden speech. How does silence itself become a medium for control, shaping perception, behavior, and even collective memory? And how much of what occurred, industrial accidents, political purges, social tension, remains hidden precisely because of this enforced quiet? Speculative accounts, often dismissed by mainstream scholarship, suggest additional layers of mystery. Some claim that Norilsk's silence order extended to suppression of environmental data. Reports of pollution, chemical exposure, or unusual mortality rates were allegedly concealed, leaving residents uninformed and outsiders unable to assess conditions accurately. Others hint at more enigmatic consequences. That prolonged silence, coupled with isolation and extreme climate, created psychological phenomena akin to collective stress disorders, hallucinations, or pervasive paranoia. While these accounts cannot be verified definitively, they contribute to a sense of Norilsk as a city both materially and psychologically contained, a place where reality itself could be mediated through silence. The interplay of geography, governance, and human psychology is striking. Norilsk is physically isolated, accessible primarily by rail or air during the brief summer thaw, and its population was, for decades, effectively trapped within this extreme environment. Layers of oversight, bureaucratic secrecy, and fear created additional psychological constraints. In such a context, silence is not merely absence of speech. It becomes a language of compliance, a signal of survival, and a tool that shapes perception and memory. What stories are lost when a community is compelled to remain quiet? How much of history is written not in records or chronicles, but in the absences and gaps created by enforced reticence? Visiting Norilsk today, one encounters a city both modern and spectral. Industrial facilities continue to dominate the skyline, but the human landscape has shifted. Descendants of workers, former prisoners, and voluntary migrants populate the streets. Yet the aura of isolation persists, amplified by the harsh environment, the lingering remnants of Soviet-era secrecy, and the knowledge that much of what occurred remains undocumented. Archaeological and archival work continues, but the full picture of the silence order and its impact on individuals, families, and the community is unlikely ever to be fully reconstructed. The Norilsk silence order, like other events in this exploration of dark historical mysteries, reminds us that human control over behavior can extend into the most intimate spaces, the thoughts, speech, and perceptions of those subjected to authority. It is a story not of overt violence, but of subtle coercion, psychological constraint, and the slow shaping of reality through omission and enforced quiet. And in this, it is perhaps more unsettling than many events defined by immediate spectacle, the power of silence to obscure truth, erase memory, and mediate life itself. As we consider the city under Arctic winter, the factories belching smoke into the pale sky, and the long corridors of dormitories and administrative buildings where voices were carefully moderated, questions linger. How did residents navigate daily life under constant observation and constraint? How much suffering, fear, and quiet defiance remains invisible to history? And when the ice recedes and records are examined, what truths might emerge, revealing both the limits of human endurance and the enduring consequences of enforced silence? The Norilsk Silence Order is more than a historical curiosity. It is a study in human adaptation, resilience, and the capacity of authority to shape both physical and psychological reality. It is a reminder that darkness does not only reside in shadowed streets or hidden chambers, but also in the gaps between words, the pauses in communication, and the quiet compliance demanded by those who wield power. And as the Arctic wind sweeps over the city, we are left with a question that echoes across time and place. How many stories, truths, and human experiences remain buried beneath the ice of history, waiting for those brave enough or curious enough to listen? And as the frozen winds of Norilsk recede from our minds, leaving behind the haunting stillness of enforced silence, history turns once again to a moment where the ordinary becomes the site of extraordinary tragedy, a place where human ingenuity, social gathering, and fragile infrastructure collide in a catastrophe that is both surreal and profoundly human. From the Arctic isolation of Norilsk, we return to the heart of Germany, to the city of Erfurt, whose medieval architecture, bustling courtyards, and communal spaces once held a secret danger, now remembered as the Erfurt Latrine disaster. Erfurt, in the late 13th century, was a thriving urban center of trade, education, and religious devotion. Its streets were narrow and winding, lined with half-timbered houses, artisan workshops, and churches whose spires pierced the skyline. Within the walls of the city, medieval life was a delicate balance. Commerce, worship, and domestic routine intertwined, creating both community cohesion and shared vulnerability. In the heart of the city, beneath the everyday activity, lay structures intended to manage human waste, a necessity in dense urban settlements, yet a silent threat whose potential for catastrophe few had considered. The disaster occurred in 1184, though some accounts vary slightly in date, highlighting the difficulty of precise historical reconstruction. The setting was the communal latrine of Erfurt, a structure suspended above the city's river Gera, designed to carry away human waste into the flowing water below. On an ordinary day, with merchants attending stalls, students bustling between schools, and clergy conducting their duties, the latrine collapsed. Estimates suggest that dozens of people were swept into the river or trapped in the debris, many perishing in the fall or succumbing to drowning. Contemporary chronicles describe the scene with a mix of shock, horror, and disbelief, emphasizing the fragility of human constructions and the precariousness of medieval urban life. Historians have examined the structural and environmental factors contributing to the disaster. The latrine itself was a suspended wooden platform, likely supported by beams that had been weakened by decay, overuse, and perhaps floodwater undermining the supports. Medieval engineering, while innovative for its time, often lacked standardized materials and rigorous testing, leaving urban infrastructure vulnerable to failure. Could this disaster have been anticipated, or was it the inevitable consequence of placing human convenience above structural caution? The collapse serves as a grim reminder that innovation and everyday necessity often coexist with unforeseen risk. Yet, as in other historical mysteries, there is more than engineering to consider. Eyewitness accounts, though scarce and filtered through the lens of chroniclers, suggest a moment of collective panic, confusion, and despair. Survivors reportedly described screams echoing through the narrow streets, the smell of filth mingling with the river's current, and the frantic attempts of neighbors to rescue those trapped. The psychological dimensions are striking. A public tragedy unfolding in a space designed for private, utilitarian purposes, where the intimacy of human bodily function became the stage for communal horror. How does ordinary life, so carefully ordered by routine, transform into a tableau of sudden chaos? And what does this reveal about the medieval understanding of safety, engineering, and the vulnerability of the human body in urban environments? Speculation has also surrounded the broader social and cultural implications of the event. Some historians suggest that the disaster was interpreted as divine punishment, a reflection of societal sin or moral failing. In a deeply religious society, sudden and dramatic deaths often carried spiritual meaning, linking human engineering failures to cosmic or divine will. Others focus on the social ramifications, public spaces, communal responsibility, and the interplay between human construction and natural forces. The Erfurt Latrine disaster, while seemingly a straightforward accident, thus becomes a lens through which we can examine medieval attitudes toward risk, mortality, and the relationship between humans and the built environment. Environmental conditions may have played a hidden role. Seasonal rains, fluctuating river levels, or structural rot could have weakened supports, creating a scenario in which a single additional load, perhaps too many people gathering simultaneously, triggered collapse. Could there have been warning signs that went unheeded, or was the disaster the product of converging circumstances beyond human perception and control? The interplay of human error, material limitation, and environmental unpredictability is central to understanding why this tragedy occurred, and why it has endured as a story that continues to fascinate historians and storytellers alike. The event also invites reflection on the mechanics of memory and record-keeping. While chroniclers preserved descriptions of the disaster, many details remain ambiguous. The exact number of victims, the identities of those involved, and the immediate societal response. Archaeological evidence offers limited insight, leaving modern historians to reconstruct the event through narrative fragments, comparison with other urban disasters, and knowledge of medieval building practices. How much of history is permanently lost to chance, neglect, or selective preservation? And how does the survival of partial accounts shape our perception of past tragedies? Walking through modern Erfurt, the city appears calm and orderly. The River Gera flows gently under stone bridges. The streets bustle with tourists and students, and medieval buildings remain standing as testaments to endurance. Yet beneath this surface, the disaster lingers as a reminder that human constructions, no matter how carefully designed, carry inherent vulnerability. The latrine collapse, though centuries old, resonates with contemporary questions about risk, public infrastructure, and the unseen consequences of routine activities. What lessons remain when tragedy strikes in the spaces we take for granted, when danger resides in the most familiar of settings? The Erfurt latrine disaster reminds us that history's darkest moments are not always the product of war, conquest, or disease. Sometimes they emerge from the intersection of human necessity, environmental pressures, and fragile engineering. The disaster is a meditation on unpredictability, on the thin line separating normalcy from catastrophe, and on the ways in which ordinary spaces can become extraordinary sites of human suffering. And as we consider the streets, rivers, and communal spaces of Erfurt today, questions linger. How often has disaster hidden in plain sight, waiting for a convergence of circumstances to reveal itself? How many human experiences have been shaped, silently and irrevocably, by structures we take for granted and forces beyond our perception? Ultimately, the Erfurt Latrine disaster is more than a historical anecdote. It is an exploration of human vulnerability, the limits of foresight, and the fragile balance between order and chaos in everyday life. It invites us to consider how ordinary infrastructure, daily routines, and social norms can intersect with the unpredictable currents of fate, leaving a mark on memory, scholarship, and imagination alike. In the quiet flow of the River Gera today, one can almost imagine the echoes of that long-ago collapse, a reminder that history often waits beneath the surface, revealing both the fragility and resilience of human endeavor. And as the echoes of Erfurt's disaster fade into memory, leaving behind the quiet murmur of a river that once witnessed sudden tragedy, history carries us across continents and centuries to the bustling streets of Southeast Asia, where human ingenuity, desperation, and unintended consequences converged in an event both bizarre and horrifying: the Great Hanoi Rat Massacre. Here in 1902, the city of Hanoi, then under French colonial rule, became the unlikely stage for one of the strangest urban catastrophes in recorded history, a tragedy that combined public health, superstition, and human error in ways that remain both instructive and unsettling. Hanoi, at the turn of the 20th century, was a city of contrasts. Colonial administration buildings with ornate French facades rose beside traditional Vietnamese wooden homes. Narrow alleys were filled with the scent of cooking fires, spices, and river water. Street vendors called to passers-by, children played near the edges of the Red River, and the daily rhythms of commerce and domestic life carried on, seemingly ordinary, under the heavy gaze of colonial authorities. Yet, beneath the vibrancy of the city, a more insidious presence had begun to assert itself. Rats, in numbers so great that they threatened both public health and the social order. The origins of the massacre lay in an ongoing struggle between humans and rodents. Cholera, plague, and other infectious diseases had made rat populations a matter of serious concern. French authorities, drawing on both scientific and administrative logic, sought to reduce the numbers by ordering organized extermination campaigns. Local populations, often caught between the demands of colonial rulers and their own practices and beliefs, were enlisted to participate. It was an effort framed as public service, but one that would quickly spiral into chaos. Authorities reportedly issued strict quotas for rat killings, sometimes demanding hundreds of rats per household, with payment contingent upon meeting the targets. Residents, eager to comply, soon faced a logistical problem. The sheer number of rats in the city outpaced natural capture. To meet quotas, some citizens began capturing young rats, killing their parents, and then breeding them to increase numbers, an unintended consequence of rigid policy and human ingenuity. The results were paradoxical, grotesque, and in retrospect, almost surreal. Efforts to reduce the rat population directly contributed to its proliferation. Contemporary accounts describe a city gripped by both fear and absurdity. Streets became crowded with caged rats. Markets displayed dead rodents by the basketful, and citizens calculated the most efficient methods for capture. Reports suggest that some residents even resorted to extreme measures, using poisoned bait, nets, and makeshift traps, and occasionally releasing captured rats elsewhere to continue the cycle. What began as a public health initiative evolved into a social phenomenon, blending urgency, superstition, and human resourcefulness into a spectacle that few could fully control. The psychological dimensions of the event are striking. For colonial authorities, the campaign was a matter of hygiene and control, an expression of administrative order imposed on an urban population. For residents, it became a combination of survival, economic opportunity, and social obligation, all complicated by fear of disease and punishment for non-compliance. How does human behavior respond when incentives, fear, and environmental pressures intersect? And when the target of action is a creature as elusive and prolific as the rat, how does the ordinary cityscape transform into a theater of chaos and unintended consequences? Medical and environmental historians have offered explanations for the epidemic's escalation. One theory emphasizes the misunderstanding of rat ecology. Killing adult rats indiscriminately without controlling breeding could accelerate population growth. Another highlights the social pressures placed on residents. Quotas, fines, and community surveillance created a form of collective compulsion, amplifying both activity and error. Yet even these analytical frameworks cannot fully capture the human experience, the panic, the ingenuity, and the absurdity that defined Hanoi during this period. The event also raises questions about the intersection of colonial authority and local culture. French administrators approached the problem with the logic of European public health science, often without regard for local practices or environmental conditions. The result was a clash between imported methods and indigenous knowledge, producing unforeseen consequences. Could this disaster have been prevented with a more nuanced understanding of the city's ecology and social dynamics? Or was the combination of human ingenuity and bureaucratic rigidity inevitably destined to create a cycle of unintended escalation? Beyond population control and urban planning, the massacre had social and symbolic dimensions. Rats had long held cultural significance, often associated with disease, luck, or pestilence. The campaign to exterminate them, therefore, resonated with local superstitions, moral fears, and collective anxieties. In attempting to impose order on a chaotic natural environment, the authorities inadvertently magnified existing tensions and created new ones. The city, already densely populated, now became a space in which human action, natural behavior, and cultural perception collided with dramatic effect. Eyewitness accounts, while limited, provide glimpses into the scene. Children running with captured rats in baskets, neighbors arguing over proper methods, and piles of carcasses accumulating in alleys and courtyards. Some observers noted the ironic spectacle, people risking their safety and social standing in pursuit of an impossible goal, while the very animals they sought to destroy continued to reproduce, escape, and reassert their presence. The line between human control and natural resilience became blurred, a reminder that even deliberate, organized intervention can falter when confronting complex ecological systems. Speculative theories have emerged around the broader implications of the event. Some suggest that the Great Hanoi Rat Massacre exemplifies the unintended consequences of bureaucratic control, highlighting the ways human systems can inadvertently exacerbate the problems they intend to solve. Others view it as a study in collective psychology, how fear, incentive structures, and social observation can produce outcomes that defy rational expectations. Could the event also reflect an early form of ecological misunderstanding, where human efforts to dominate the environment collide with the adaptive capacities of other species, yielding consequences both tragic and absurd? Walking through modern Hanoi today, the city pulses with energy, blending centuries-old architecture, colonial-era buildings, and contemporary urban life. The Red River flows steadily, oblivious to the chaos of over a century ago. Yet in the minds of historians and curious observers, the events of 1902 linger as a reminder of the fragility of human planning, the persistence of nature, and the complexities of social behavior. What appears ordinary, a bustling city, a problem of pests, can, under the right conditions, transform into a moment of near farcical tragedy, yet with real human consequences. The Great Hanoi Rat Massacre also prompts reflection on the limits of historical knowledge. Documentation is incomplete. Much of the story survives through colonial reports, anecdotal accounts, and oral histories, each filtered through the biases, fears, and objectives of their authors. How much detail has been lost to time? How much remains obscured by selective reporting, social shame, or bureaucratic minimization? And what does this reveal about our understanding of urban catastrophes, human-environment interactions, and the unintended outcomes of social policy? Ultimately, the massacre is a story of unintended consequences, a cautionary tale about the interplay between human authority, social compliance, and natural resilience. It reminds us that even well-intentioned actions can yield unpredictable results, and that the line between order and chaos is often thinner than we imagine. The city of Hanoi, vibrant, resilient, and alive, hides within its history a moment where fear, ingenuity, and miscalculation converged, leaving an imprint on both the human and animal population. As we imagine the streets of early 20th century Hanoi, the clatter of baskets, the cries of children, and the rustle of countless rats underfoot, we are left with a question that echoes beyond a single event. How often do our interventions, guided by reason, fear, or authority, produce outcomes that defy expectation? And what other episodes of history, silent, overlooked, or dismissed as absurd, linger in the shadows, waiting for rediscovery, reflection, and the unsettling recognition of how little we may truly control the worlds we inhabit? And as the chaos of Hanoi recedes into memory, the streets lined with baskets of rats, the echoes of frantic human effort, and the unintended consequences of fear and authority, we return now to the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, where human vulnerability intersects with the relentless power of nature. The city of Galveston, Texas, in the early 20th century, was a bustling port and a community of contrasts, wealth and poverty, commerce and domesticity, hope and uncertainty. Within its neighborhoods stood an institution meant to shelter and nurture the city's most vulnerable, an orphanage. But in 1900, this haven became the site of a tragedy that remains etched into the annals of American history, the Galveston Orphanage tragedy. Galveston, perched on a narrow barrier island, was already familiar with the forces of the Gulf, violent storms, unpredictable tides, and the constant threat of flooding. The island's geography, a flat, low-lying expanse barely above sea level, rendered it exquisitely susceptible to hurricanes, even in a period when meteorological science was limited and storm warnings rudimentary at best. Within this precarious landscape, human life and construction existed in a delicate balance, and nowhere was this more poignant than in the buildings that sheltered children, the most defenseless members of society. The orphanage in question was modest but functional, a two-story structure built of brick and timber, with dormitories, dining halls, and classrooms arranged around a central courtyard. Children, many of them recently orphaned or abandoned, carried the weight of loss and displacement, seeking security in the routines of care, meals, and instruction. Staff members worked diligently, yet even with good intentions, the institution operated within the limits of both human capacity and structural resilience. The tragedy unfolded on September 8, 1900, as the Galveston hurricane, one of the deadliest storms in American history, approached the island. Winds of over 135 miles per hour and a storm surge exceeding 15 feet threatened every structure, every life, every moment. The city's limited warning systems left residents with scant time to prepare, and the orphanage, located near the waterfront, was particularly exposed. Accounts from survivors describe the rising water, the howling wind, and the frantic efforts of caretakers to secure the children in the upper stories of the building. Yet the storm's ferocity overwhelmed even these measures. The building itself, constructed to withstand ordinary weather, could not endure the hurricane's full force. Roof timbers splintered, windows shattered, and walls cracked under the relentless pressure. The storm surge swept through the lower floors, and in the chaos, many children were trapped, unable to escape the rising waters. Eyewitness reports, fragmentary yet haunting, describe the cries of children, the desperate attempts of staff to reach them, and the merciless advance of the surge. Some were carried into the streets, others trapped in rooms that filled with water, and still more clung to furniture or each other in vain attempts to survive. Historical records indicate that dozens of children perished in the orphanage that day, though exact numbers are difficult to verify. Survivors recounted a mixture of terror, confusion, and, in some cases, miraculous rescue. Staff members and neighbors risked their lives to save as many as possible, forming human chains or venturing into the floodwaters to retrieve children from rooftops or debris. The tragedy's scale, amplified by the hurricane's broader devastation of Galveston, which claimed thousands of lives citywide, remains difficult to comprehend. How does one measure human loss in the face of forces so vast, so indiscriminate? The Galveston Orphanage. Tragedy also invites reflection on the intersection of natural disaster, social responsibility, and institutional preparedness. Could the disaster have been mitigated with improved building techniques, more robust emergency planning, or earlier warnings? Or were the forces at play so overwhelming that no human foresight could have prevented the loss? Some historians emphasize the limitations of early 20th century meteorology, while others point to systemic inequalities. Orphanages often housed children in the most vulnerable parts of cities, their locations chosen for convenience rather than safety, exposing the most defenseless to environmental hazard. Beyond structural and procedural considerations, there is a psychological and social dimension to the tragedy that continues to resonate. How did the surviving children process the trauma? How did the staff cope with the simultaneous duties of care and rescue under conditions of extreme peril? Oral histories and scattered diary entries suggest a mix of grief, guilt, and resilience, but the full scope of human experience, the fear, the courage, the confusion, remains largely invisible, encoded in the silence of lost lives and fragmented accounts. Speculative interpretations have emerged in the years since, attempting to understand the tragedy beyond meteorology and logistics. Some suggest that premonitions, local folklore, and cultural attitudes toward hurricanes shaped both preparation and response, influencing human behavior in subtle but significant ways. Others explore the symbolic dimensions, the vulnerability of children as emblematic of societal fragility, the orphanage as a microcosm of human dependence, and the storm itself as a reminder of nature's indifference to social hierarchy or institutional authority. While these interpretations cannot replace factual reconstruction, they illuminate the deeper human context in which the disaster occurred. The physical landscape of Galveston today bears little resemblance to the scene of 1900. Modern seawalls, elevated structures, and advanced warning systems provide a buffer against the fury of the Gulf, yet the memory of past disasters lingers in the city's collective consciousness. The orphanage itself no longer stands, but its story survives in records, survivor accounts, and the occasional anecdotal reference passed down through generations. In contemplating this event, one is struck by the persistence of human vulnerability, the thin line between safety and catastrophe, and the ways in which ordinary institutions, homes, schools, orphanages, become theaters of both care and peril under extreme conditions. The tragedy also raises questions about the ethics and responsibility of care. How do societies protect the most defenseless in times of crisis? What are the limits of human foresight, engineering, and compassion in the face of overwhelming natural forces? And when disaster occurs, how are memory, justice, and commemoration negotiated for those who cannot speak for themselves? The Galveston Orphanage. Tragedy, like other dark moments in history, challenges observers to confront both practical and philosophical questions, the interplay between human planning, environmental unpredictability, and the moral imperative to safeguard life. Walking through the historical context, one can almost imagine the orphanage under siege, the wind rattling shutters, rain lashing against brick walls, and water rising through the lower floors while children cling to each other in fear. The world outside, streets, rivers, and the broader city, is itself being reshaped by nature's fury, yet the most intimate horrors unfold indoors, where the intersection of human vulnerability and environmental force is most acute. What strategies did caretakers employ? What choices were made under duress? And what moments of heroism or desperation remain unrecorded, lost to the turbulence of time and tide? Ultimately, the Galveston Orphanage tragedy is a meditation on fragility. Fragility of structures, of plans, of life itself. It reveals the unpredictability of natural disasters, the limitations of human foresight, and the enduring impact of tragedy on collective memory. It reminds us that even well-intentioned institutions, designed to protect and nurture, are vulnerable when confronted by forces beyond human control. And as the Gulf winds blow across Galveston today, one is left to wonder, how many other tragedies, hidden within the folds of history, await rediscovery? How do the stories of those lost and the courage of those who survived continue to shape our understanding of human resilience, responsibility, and the haunting power of nature itself? In reflecting on the orphanage, the children, and the storm, we confront questions without easy answers. What does it mean to care for the vulnerable in a world capable of overwhelming them? How do we reconcile human agency with forces beyond our comprehension? And in remembering such events, do we honor the past, illuminate patterns of human and environmental interaction, or simply glimpse the fragile, ephemeral line between life and catastrophe? The tragedy of Galveston's orphanage endures not only as a historical fact, but as an invitation to ponder the depths of human vulnerability, the unpredictability of nature, and the mysteries that still haunt us centuries later. And as the waters of Galveston recede from our minds, the cries of children, the rush of the storm, the silent devastation that lingered long after the hurricane passed, history draws us once again toward the restless interplay between humanity and the sea. From the Gulf Coast of Texas, we travel north to the treacherous mudflats and tidal channels of the North Sea, to a region that once hosted a thriving medieval settlement known as Rungholt. Here, along the coast of what is now northern Germany, lies a story of human ingenuity, mystery, and a quiet disappearance that has fascinated historians, archaeologists, and storytellers for centuries: the silent evacuation of Rungholt. Rungholt was no ordinary village. By the 13th and 14th centuries, it had grown into a prosperous community, built upon the fertile marshlands of the Eiderstedt Peninsula in the region known as North Frisia. The village thrived on trade, salt production, and agriculture, its residents mastering the delicate balance of life along the edge of the sea. Elevated mounds, called wharfs, served as protection against high tides, while dikes and canals were constructed with laborious care to reclaim land from the relentless North Sea. At its height, Rungholt was said to comprise hundreds of homes, workshops, and barns, a bustling hub of commerce and domestic life in a landscape otherwise defined by water and mud. Yet the very element that sustained Rungholt, its proximity to the sea, also held the seeds of its undoing. The North Sea is a notoriously capricious body of water, capable of sudden storm surges and violent tidal fluctuations. Historical records suggest that by the late 14th century, Rungholt was increasingly vulnerable to flooding, as the dikes and embankments struggled to hold back the encroaching waters. The community had endured smaller floods for generations, adapting through engineering, vigilance, and collective labor. But in 1362, the sea would rise with a force that tested both human resilience and imagination. The event most commonly associated with Rungholt's disappearance is the St. Marcellus's flood, which struck in January 1362. Contemporary chronicles describe a night in which the sea advanced with sudden ferocity, swallowing homes, livestock, and farmland in an unrelenting surge. Yet there are intriguing accounts suggesting that the evacuation, or disappearance, of Rungholt may not have been entirely sudden. Local legends speak of a silent withdrawal, as if the community anticipated the impending catastrophe and fled in quiet order, leaving few survivors behind to recount the full story. How could an entire settlement vanish so thoroughly, leaving only traces in mud and memory? And what does this imply about medieval awareness, communication, and the limits of survival in coastal landscapes? Archaeological investigation has revealed fragments of Rungholt beneath the shifting sands and tidal flats. Wooden foundations, remnants of dikes, and traces of homes occasionally emerge at low tide, offering tantalizing glimpses into a lost world. Yet these discoveries raise more questions than they answer. Why is so little evidence of human life preserved, despite the village's apparent size and prosperity? Did the villagers truly evacuate in an organized manner, or were the remaining records, largely oral and fragmentary, colored by later imagination and myth-making? Could some residents have been swept away, their fates merging into legend, while others abandoned property and community in a silent bid for survival? Mainstream historians generally argue that the St. Marcellus's flood was catastrophic enough to destroy Rungholt almost completely, asserting that death and displacement account for the village's disappearance. The physical evidence, the absence of intact buildings, the layers of silt and sand covering foundations, and the erosion of the coastline, supports this interpretation. Yet the notion of a silent evacuation introduces an element of ambiguity that challenges purely structural explanations. Could the community have had prior warning, perhaps through observation of tides, weather patterns, or local knowledge passed down through generations? And if so, why does the historical record preserve so little of their survival strategies, escape routes, or decision-making processes? Speculative accounts, often treated cautiously by scholars, suggest alternative possibilities. Some propose that the villagers possessed advanced knowledge of dike reinforcement, early flood management, or even rudimentary meteorological observation, enabling partial evacuation. Others interpret local legends, stories of whispered warnings, ghostly apparitions along the dikes, and towns vanishing beneath waves, as metaphorical reflections of trauma and loss rather than literal history. Yet the very persistence of these stories suggests that the memory of Rungholt's disappearance left a profound imprint on collective consciousness, one that blended fact, interpretation, and imagination into a haunting narrative. The landscape itself contributes to the mystery. The North Frisian coast is a shifting environment, where tides, sediment, and storms constantly reshape the terrain. Archaeologists note that parts of Rungholt's former territory are now submerged several meters beneath tidal flats, accessible only at low tide or with specialized equipment. How much has been lost to natural processes, and how much of the story can be reconstructed from what remains? The sea has a way of erasing evidence, yet preserving echoes in mud, wood fragments, and oral tradition. In this sense, the silent evacuation may also refer to the gradual disappearance of tangible traces, a disappearance mediated not solely by human action, but by geological and hydrological forces over centuries. Social and economic factors must also be considered. Rungholt was a community dependent on land reclaimed from the sea, a precarious enterprise requiring constant maintenance of dikes and drainage channels. Economic pressures, harvest failures, labor shortages, or political upheaval could have undermined communal resilience in the years leading up to the flood. Could the silent evacuation have been a pragmatic response to worsening conditions, a migration to safer territory motivated not only by immediate danger, but also by long-term survival considerations? Or does the legend of an organized withdrawal obscure the real chaos, fear, and desperation that likely accompanied any escape from rising waters. Human psychology under such circumstances is a compelling element of the story. How do communities respond to the anticipation of overwhelming natural force? What role do collective memory, rumor, and cultural belief play in shaping decisions? Local folklore describes Rungholt as a wealthy but morally decadent place, punished by the sea for hubris. Whether this is moral allegory or historical reflection, it illustrates the human tendency to interpret disaster through narrative frameworks, to seek meaning in loss, and to encode lessons for future generations. The notion of a silent evacuation resonates not only as a possible historical reality, but also as a symbolic meditation on prudence, awareness, and the fragile boundaries between survival and catastrophe. The archaeology of Rungholt continues to intrigue scholars and enthusiasts alike. Excavations have revealed the layout of streets, building foundations, and evidence of defensive structures, yet so many gaps remain. What happened to the residents who may have fled? Were there temporary settlements on nearby higher ground? And how does one differentiate between material evidence of destruction and evidence of deliberate evacuation? The interplay between what remains, what is imagined, and what is recorded creates a liminal space, a shadowy border between history and legend. Even today, the tidal flats around the former site of Rungholt are imbued with mystery. At low tide, wooden posts and traces of habitation emerge, but they vanish again as the sea reclaims its territory. Visitors and researchers report an eerie quiet, broken only by the wind and the distant roar of the North Sea. Some claim to hear ghostly echoes, footsteps, voices, or the clang of bells that once hung in the village church, though such experiences are impossible to verify. Yet these impressions, whether literal or metaphorical, reinforce the haunting presence of a community that seems to have withdrawn silently, leaving only traces in mud, legend, and the imagination. The silent evacuation of Rungholt is, in many ways, a study in ambiguity. It asks us to consider the interplay between human knowledge, environmental forces, and historical memory. It challenges us to question what we know about medieval coastal life, the limits of preparedness, and the resilience of communities in extreme circumstances. And it reminds us that history is rarely a simple record of events. It is a palimpsest of fact, rumor, interpretation, and imagination, shaped as much by what disappears as by what remains. As we envision Rungholt in its final days, the inhabitants moving quietly along dikes, the wind tugging at their clothing, the distant swell of the North Sea, the cries of children mingling with the creaking of timbers, questions arise that remain unanswered. Did they succeed in fleeing entirely? How many perished in the waters, and how many survived in anonymity elsewhere? And how much of what we call history is filtered through the fog of legend, myth, and imagination, leaving us only fragments of what once was? The story of Rungholt invites reflection on broader themes: the impermanence of human settlement in the face of nature's power, the psychological and social dimensions of collective evacuation, and the tension between material evidence and oral memory. It suggests that human communities, even in their most organized and prosperous forms, are always vulnerable to forces beyond their control, and that sometimes the most profound historical mysteries arise not from violence or malice, but from the quiet withdrawal of life, leaving only hints beneath sand, water, and legend. And so, as the North Sea continues to ebb and flow over the remains of Rungholt, as mudflats shift and tides reclaim the past, we are left with an enduring question. What other communities, lost to time and tide, have vanished in silence, leaving traces only in whispered stories, fleeting wooden posts, or the imagination of those who seek to reconstruct what once was? How much of history is shaped by what is recorded, and how much by what disappears quietly into the landscape, waiting for those who are curious enough to seek it out? The silent evacuation of Rungholt is not merely an account of medieval disaster. It is an exploration of human vulnerability, resilience, and the enduring mystery of vanished communities. It reminds us that history can be as much about absence as presence, about what disappears as well as what endures, and about the haunting power of places and events that exist only in fragments, waiting for us to uncover, ponder, and wonder what might still lie hidden beneath the tides. And as the silent mudflats of Rungholt slowly fade beneath the North Sea, leaving behind only traces of vanished lives and whispered legends, history guides us now into a quieter, yet no less enigmatic realm, one where human perception, domestic space, and inexplicable imagery converge. In the small village of Belmez de la Moraleda, in southern Spain, a phenomenon emerged in the late 20th century that would perplex scientists, investigators, and believers alike. The Belmez faces. On an ordinary kitchen floor, in an otherwise unremarkable home, faces began to appear. Faces etched into concrete as if by unseen hands, each with its own expression, gaze, and presence, staring silently from the cold, gray surface. The story begins in 1971, when Maria Gomez Camara, a resident of Belmez, first noticed the appearance of a human face on the cement floor of her kitchen. At first, it was a faint outline, barely perceptible, resembling the contours of a human visage in repose. Yet over days and weeks, the image became more defined, more unsettlingly lifelike. Neighbors and visitors reported a chill in the air, an uneasy sense of being observed. The face, while immobile, seemed to hold attention in a way that ordinary images do not, prompting curiosity, fear, and a sense of profound mystery. Over time, additional faces appeared on the floor, each distinct. Some smiling faintly, others contorted in anguish, their eyes seeming to follow observers as they moved across the room. Attempts to remove them, chipping away concrete, repainting, or covering with tiles, proved ineffective. According to accounts, the faces would reemerge, sometimes in the same location, sometimes elsewhere, always seemingly independent of human effort. The phenomenon was observed by a range of individuals, from curious locals to journalists, and even scientists, who came to study the site under controlled conditions. From a scientific perspective, the phenomenon raises immediate questions about cause and mechanism. Concrete is not a medium typically associated with spontaneous imagery. It hardens under chemical processes that are generally uniform and predictable. Could variations in curing, impurities in the mix, or natural cracking account for these precise, lifelike forms? Skeptics have argued that pareidolia, the tendency of humans to perceive familiar patterns in random textures, might explain the faces. Yet photographs and eyewitness testimonies suggest a level of detail and consistency that challenges purely psychological explanations. How could mere chance or imagination produce a succession of faces, each with individualized expressions, emerging over months or even years? Investigators considered other possibilities as well. Some suggested deliberate hoaxing, pointing to potential motives of attention or notoriety. Yet Maria Gomez and her family consistently denied manipulation, and numerous controls were instituted. Floors were sealed, rooms monitored, and concrete examined chemically. While no definitive evidence of human fabrication was found, the sheer subtlety and reproducibility of the faces left room for doubt. If not trickery, then what natural or paranormal process could account for the phenomenon? Are these appearances purely physical, products of chemical or mineral reactions in concrete, or do they represent something beyond ordinary material explanation? Local folklore adds another layer of mystery. Belmez, like many villages in Andalusia, carries a history steeped in legend, superstition, and tales of supernatural occurrences. Some residents connected the faces to spirits of the deceased, interpreting the kitchen floor as a medium through which the dead could express themselves. Others linked the phenomenon to curses, moral transgressions, or psychic energy lingering in spaces marked by human habitation. While such interpretations cannot be verified scientifically, they reflect a cultural framework in which inexplicable events acquire moral, spiritual, and social significance. What does it mean, then, that a commonplace domestic space, a kitchen floor, became a canvas for such expressions, blurring the boundaries between material reality and collective imagination? Photographs of the faces circulated internationally, drawing attention from researchers, parapsychologists, and the media. Each new image prompted fresh scrutiny. Experts examined chemical composition, porosity, humidity levels, and microscopic structures in an attempt to find a rational explanation. Some argued that the faces might result from a rare form of microbial activity or mineral crystallization, although no scientific consensus emerged. Others speculated about psychokinesis or residual energy linked to intense human emotion in the home. Regardless of theory, the phenomenon defied simple classification, occupying a liminal space between the plausible and the unexplained. The human response to the Belmez faces is as compelling as the phenomenon itself. Visitors frequently describe a sense of unease, the impression that the faces are watching or communicating in ways beyond verbal expression. Some observers reported emotional reactions, sadness, fear, nostalgia, as if the faces carried the weight of memory or history. Psychologists have noted that such responses are common when humans encounter anthropomorphic forms in unexpected contexts. Yet the intensity and consistency of reactions in this case remain remarkable. How much of the effect arises from the faces themselves, and how much from the human mind seeking patterns, stories, and meaning? An enduring question is the origin of the faces. Did they emerge spontaneously from the physical properties of the concrete? Are they a product of residual energy, unknown forces, or human consciousness interacting with material reality? Or are they a psychological mirror, reflecting collective fear, hope, or fascination with death and identity? Attempts to replicate the phenomenon have largely failed, yet the original faces continue to captivate scholars, mystics, and curious travelers. Could there be an interaction between physical conditions and human attention that produces these recurring patterns? And if so, what does this imply about the nature of perception, the limits of scientific understanding, and the relationship between mind and matter? The chronology of the Belmez faces adds to the intrigue. New images appeared intermittently, sometimes months apart, each with different features and expressions. Some faces remained visible for years, while others faded naturally or were obscured by repairs. The dynamic quality of the phenomenon suggests a process that is neither wholly permanent nor entirely transient, a rhythm that defies conventional understanding. In this sense, the faces resemble a living archive of observation, memory, or perhaps something more enigmatic, a slow dialogue between the material world and human consciousness. Beyond the scientific and paranormal implications, the Belmez faces invite reflection on human fascination with the unknown. Why are we drawn to events that elude explanation? Why do faces, in particular, carry such profound emotional weight, whether carved in stone, painted on walls, or emerging mysteriously on concrete? Perhaps it is the combination of recognition and ambiguity, the sense of familiarity coupled with the impossibility of full comprehension, that captivates us. In a quiet kitchen in southern Spain, amid the ordinary sounds of domestic life, the extraordinary emerged. A reminder that even the most mundane environments can harbor mysteries that challenge perception, belief, and understanding. Visitors to Belmez today still speak of the faces with a mixture of awe and unease. The house remains a site of pilgrimage for those intrigued by the unexplained, a locus where ordinary domesticity meets the uncanny. Each face is a testament to the enduring power of mystery, silent, immobile, yet charged with the weight of observation, memory, and unanswered questions. They compel us to confront the boundaries between the known and the unknowable, between scientific explanation and the persistence of wonder. The Belmez faces also provoke broader contemplation about human engagement with the inexplicable. How do we reconcile desire for rationality with the persistent allure of phenomena that defy it? What can such mysteries teach us about perception, cultural interpretation, and the ways in which human consciousness interacts with the material world? And if even a single face on a kitchen floor can captivate the imagination of an entire world, what other subtle, overlooked anomalies lie hidden in the spaces we inhabit daily, awaiting discovery or reflection? Ultimately, the Belmez faces phenomenon reminds us that mystery need not always be loud, violent, or catastrophic to haunt us. Unlike hurricanes, massacres, or vanished towns, these faces are quiet, intimate, and personal, yet their impact is profound. They challenge our understanding of reality, the boundaries of science, and the ways in which humans perceive, interpret, and respond to the inexplicable. In the silent gaze of each visage, we confront questions that remain unanswered. Are these faces a product of chance, human influence, or forces beyond comprehension? And perhaps most hauntingly, what do they reveal about our own capacity to witness, to perceive, and to be unsettled by the world around us, As we linger on the concrete floors of Maria Gomez's home, imagining the faces emerging slowly, with subtle shifts and expressions that seem almost alive, we are drawn into a contemplative space. The phenomenon invites us to slow down, to look closely, and to consider the possibilities that lie at the margins of understanding. Could the Belmez faces be a window into a hidden dimension of perception? A trace of energy, emotion, or consciousness imprinted on matter? Or are they, in the end, a reflection of our deepest fascination with human presence, identity, and the uncanny capacity of ordinary spaces to harbor the extraordinary? The Belmez faces remain, as they have for decades, a silent enigma. They challenge observers to question the limits of perception, the reliability of material reality, and the boundaries between fact, legend, and human interpretation. They remind us that even in familiar domestic spaces, the world can surprise us, unsettle us, and compel us to wonder. And as we move forward through history's darker mysteries, these faces, quiet, watchful, inexplicable, linger in our minds, a reminder that not all haunting is loud, and that sometimes the most profound mysteries are those that stare back at us silently from the places we least expect. And as the silent faces of Belmez linger in our imagination, watching, immobile, yet impossibly present, we turn our gaze eastward toward the vast, cold expanses of Siberia, where the skies themselves seem to have played a role in one of history's most enigmatic and unsettling environmental phenomena, the Zarnitsa Black Rain event. Unlike hurricanes, vanished villages, or mysterious images in concrete, this is a story of the sky and its dark, unanticipated consequences. A moment when the heavens poured a substance that was as incomprehensible as it was dangerous, leaving behind questions that continue to haunt those who study it. The event occurred in 1957 in the Zarnitsa area of Russia, near the remote edges of the Siberian steppe. Local inhabitants reported an unusual and foreboding change in the atmosphere. Clouds darkened in a way that seemed unnatural, taking on a dense, almost viscous quality, heavy with a substance that was not rain as it is usually known. When the precipitation finally fell, it was black. Dark droplets, staining the earth and vegetation, covering homes, livestock, and fields, produced a scene that was both otherworldly and alarming. The rain itself emitted a chemical-like odor, causing unease, discomfort, and a lingering sense of danger. Scientists dispatched to the area collected samples of the rain, seeking to understand its composition. Analyses revealed the presence of high levels of strontium-90 and other radioactive isotopes, an extraordinary finding for precipitation. The presence of radioactivity immediately drew connections to the era's broader geopolitical and environmental context. The height of the Cold War, rapid testing of nuclear devices, and ongoing experimentation with atmospheric dispersal of radiation. Yet even in this framework, Zarnitsa was unusual. The local population reported effects that were immediate and unsettling, from skin irritation to livestock illness, and crops damaged despite the absence of conventional environmental causes. The phenomenon of black rain is not entirely unknown. Fallout from nuclear tests, industrial pollution, and even volcanic eruptions have produced discoloration in precipitation throughout history. Yet, Zarnitsa's combination of color, radioactive content, and localized impact distinguished it from ordinary occurrences. How could a single, isolated rain event concentrate radioactivity in such a manner? Was it a natural atmospheric anomaly, an unintended consequence of distant nuclear testing, or something else entirely? The questions remain largely unanswered, and the answers point to the intersection of natural systems, human activity, and events that escape conventional explanation. Eyewitness accounts of the event offer a compelling and disturbing glimpse into human experience under extraordinary environmental stress. Residents described the sky darkening to a near twilight, a suffocating heaviness in the air, and the sudden onset of black droplets falling silently, as if the storm were deliberate and directed. The rain left behind streaks on rooftops and streets, an oily, sooty residue on fields and gardens, and an indelible mark on memory. Animals became restless or sickly, plants blackened under the unusual moisture, and a pervasive unease spread through the community. In considering these reactions, we are forced to ask, how do ordinary people interpret and survive events that lie outside normal patterns of weather and ecology? And what psychological imprint does such an inexplicable phenomenon leave on a region, a population, or even the broader collective imagination? Investigations into Zarnitsa were conducted by Soviet scientists, some of whom had access to classified information regarding nuclear tests and atmospheric studies. Reports, partially declassified decades later, confirmed the presence of radioactive isotopes in both water and soil samples, yet did not definitively explain the mechanism by which they became concentrated in this particular rainstorm. Some researchers proposed that an atmospheric disturbance, combined with prevailing wind patterns, might have carried fallout from distant tests, but skepticism remains. The density of radioactivity in the precipitation, its timing, and its localized character suggest a process that does not fit neatly within known meteorological models. Beyond scientific analysis, the event carries cultural and psychological resonance. Locals often framed the rain as a manifestation of angered natural forces or divine intervention, a symbolic punishment reflecting the anxieties of the nuclear age. Stories of blackened fields, the sickly appearance of animals, and the eerie metallic smell of the air circulated widely, embedding the event within collective memory as something more than mere environmental contamination. Could the human mind, confronted with such an anomaly, have amplified the perception of threat? Or did the rain itself contain qualities that were genuinely hazardous, perceptible through subtle sensory or biological cues, independent of narrative interpretation? Speculative accounts have expanded on these uncertainties, suggesting alternative explanations. Some theorists have proposed atmospheric anomalies linked to solar activity or geomagnetic fluctuations, creating conditions for unusual precipitation. Others consider chemical or nuclear accidents as potential causes, pointing to the Soviet Union's extensive network of secretive testing and industrial operations. Even fringe perspectives have emerged. Notions of extraterrestrial intervention, manipulation of weather by unknown forces, or phenomena yet to be understood by conventional science. While these remain conjectural, they underscore the enduring allure and perplexity of the Zarnitsa Black Rain event, demonstrating how a single meteorological anomaly can stimulate decades of inquiry, debate, and speculation. One of the most intriguing aspects of Zarnitsa is its ephemeral yet lasting impact. The black rain fell, left its mark, and receded, yet the consequences persisted. Contaminated soil, disrupted ecosystems, and the indelible imprint on human memory. For residents, the event became a reference point for understanding environmental risk, an early encounter with the intersection of human technological capacity and natural unpredictability. Researchers continue to analyze sediment cores, soil samples, and historical records, seeking to reconstruct the exact chemical and isotopic profile of the precipitation. Yet the full narrative remains elusive. How do we reconcile the apparent specificity of such an event with the broader patterns of environmental phenomena? And what lessons might remain hidden, waiting to be uncovered beneath layers of soil, water, and historical documentation? The psychological dimension of Zarnitsa is as compelling as the physical. Observers often report a sense of unease, a feeling of being watched or overwhelmed, as if the rain carried more than mere chemicals. Could this be a natural response to the uncanny, a phenomenon of human cognition triggered by the extraordinary? Or is it possible that subtle, undetected environmental cues, radiation, metallic particles, or atmospheric ions, interacted with human physiology in ways that were perceptible but poorly understood? The boundary between objective observation and subjective experience becomes blurred, reminding us that the human response to mystery is itself part of the phenomenon. The event also invites reflection on broader environmental and historical contexts. Occurring during a period of rapid technological experimentation, nuclear testing, and environmental transformation, Zarnitsa highlights the unpredictable interplay between human activity and natural systems. It is a reminder that the air we breathe, the rain that falls, and the landscapes we inhabit are not neutral backdrops, but dynamic systems capable of producing outcomes beyond immediate comprehension. How often might similar events have occurred without notice, leaving only whispers in memory or traces in sediment? And how much of the environmental history of the 20th century remains hidden, obscured by secrecy, fear, or simple forgetfulness? In contemplating Zarnitsa, we are drawn to the intersection of science, perception, and the unexplained. The rain itself, a dark, viscous, radioactive precipitation, defies easy categorization, yet it anchors our investigation in tangible evidence: soil, water, eyewitness accounts. At the same time, the responses of those who experienced it, the fear, the stories, the cultural interpretations, remind us that the human dimension is inseparable from any analysis of mysterious events. How do humans assign meaning to phenomena they cannot control or fully understand? And how do these events shape collective memory, cultural narrative, and scientific curiosity for generations? The Zarnitsa Black Rain event persists in both historical record and cultural imagination as a haunting example of nature's unpredictability intertwined with human technology. It challenges our assumptions about meteorology, nuclear testing, and the boundaries of scientific understanding, while simultaneously illustrating the profound psychological and social impact of environmental anomalies. Unlike the quiet, domestic eeriness of the Belmez faces, Zarnitsa was loud in effect, darkening skies, staining fields, and disrupting daily life. But the questions it raises are just as silent, subtle, and enduring. What forces converged to produce such a localized, unusual event? and how much of what we perceive is filtered through human interpretation, fear, or expectation. As we envision the black rain falling across the Siberian plains, droplets streaking the landscape, leaving an acrid smell, staining crops and unsettling the human and animal populations alike, we are confronted with the mystery in its full intensity, a moment when the sky itself became a medium of inexplicable and unsettling change. And in the quiet that followed, in the investigation, analysis, and contemplation that has stretched over decades, we are reminded that not all mysteries are violent, immediate, or easily catalogued. Some linger in observation, in sediment, in memory, anomalies that defy explanation yet persist, beckoning us to explore, question, and wonder. The Zarnitsa Black Rain event remains, to this day, a reminder that the environment is a repository of unsolved mysteries. It asks us to consider the interplay between human technology, natural forces, and the limits of perception. It challenges us to reflect on the ways in which extraordinary events leave enduring traces in the material and psychological world. And perhaps most hauntingly, it confronts us with the possibility that the world is filled with phenomena that elude our understanding, leaving us to ponder, decades or centuries later, the precise nature of what fell from the sky that day, and what it might mean for the fragile relationship between humans and the natural world.